In June 2024, two nations inked a deal that made the world shudder. Dubbed the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, this wasn't just another pact barely worth the paper it was printed on. It was a declaration of defiance against the US and its allies, wrapped in grandiose promises of a just and multipolar new world order. Sounds noble, right? Not when you know the players involved. Russia and North Korea. On one side, you've got Russia, a pariah state stumbling under the weight of its disastrous Ukraine war. On the other, North Korea, a nuclear-armed hermit kingdom ruled by a man with policies as striking as his haircut. But somehow, in this cruel, chaotic world, Russian President Vladimir Putin and Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un found each other. A match made in authoritarian heaven. Before the pact between the world's most volatile dictatorship and the world's most belligerent wannabe superpower was even ratified, North Korea sent over 10,000 troops to Russia, a move NATO immediately branded as a dangerous escalation. But little did NATO, and even Putin, know that there was absolutely nothing dangerous about these troops. Think less battle-hardened warriors and more poorly rehearsed extras in a military parade. It immediately became clear that Kim didn't send his best. He sent his leftovers, and Putin, he fell for it. Let's break down this massive joke played on Putin and its implications for the war in Ukraine. To understand just how this farce unfolded, we need to look at these North Korean troops in more detail, where they are, what they're doing, and why Putin thought they were the answer to his problems. Though different figures have been thrown around for weeks, the latest estimates put the total number of North Korean soldiers in Russia at around 11,000. According to Ukraine's Defense Intelligence (GUR), about 2,000 of them have joined Russian units, while the remaining 9,000 act as a reserve force in what appears to be a strategy to fill secondary positions. These roles include guarding checkpoints, digging fortifications, and holding observation posts, tasks that free up Russian soldiers for frontline combat. However, some reports suggest that this could just be the beginning. Ukrainian intelligence speculates Pyongyang could send up to 100,000 troops in the future. Now, this would undoubtedly be an unsettling prospect if it weren't for how utterly useless these troops have proven to be. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. These North Korean troops reportedly started arriving in Russia in October, then traveled another 4,000 miles from Vladivostok to Kursk. The Kursk region is also where most of these troops have taken up positions, working alongside Russian units like the 22nd Motorized Rifle Regiment and the 11th Separate Air Assault Brigade. Reports suggest that Russia has amassed a combined force of 50,000 soldiers, including the North Koreans, with a single goal: retake the territory seized by Ukraine during its summer offensive. The North Korean element aligns with Putin's attempts to solve Russia's ongoing manpower crisis without triggering a politically risky mass mobilization. With casualty estimates nearing 762,000 and recruitment struggling to keep pace, Putin simply needs every extra soldier he can find. But you know what they say, be careful what you wish for. Sometimes having no soldiers might be better than inheriting an army so inept that it's practically a liability, and Putin is learning this lesson as we speak. You see, the soldiers sent to Russia are nothing but North Korea's rejects. Clumsy, unfit, and completely unqualified. They're less of an army and more of a collection of military misfits. But this shouldn't be surprising to anyone familiar with the North Korean military. Sure, North Korea might have 1.3 million active duty personnel, making it one of the largest armies in the world. However, that's all Kim cares about. Quantity. It's certainly not quality. The entire structure of the North Korean military is designed around brute manpower, not modern warfare. Training is minimal and outdated, so much so that some of the North Korean soldiers sent to Russia couldn't even hold a rifle without dropping it. Of course, there's nothing shocking about this, given that their training is also limited by severe shortages. Fuel, ammunition, and modern equipment are all in critically short supply. Defectors from North Korea often reveal that many soldiers spend more time farming potatoes than firing weapons, as they are regularly diverted to boost the struggling civilian economy. Even the special operations units, the so-called elite, don't fare much better. Their equipment is often unavailable due to supply chain breakdowns caused by international sanctions and internal mismanagement. The absurdity of deploying such troops was laid bare in intercepted Russian communications, where one frustrated soldier exclaimed, "What do we do with them?" This sentiment, augmented by an expletive or two, speaks volumes about the combat readiness of the North Korean troops. But let's be honest, North Korean soldiers still have it worse than their Russian counterparts. After all, they're practically skeletons, walking embodiments of the country's chronic food crisis. So it's no wonder the North Koreans in Russia can't complete some basic physical tasks like jogging just 65 feet. Of course, this is no anomaly among a population accustomed to malnourishment, but the soldiers truly have it rough. A perverse belief that hunger makes for tougher soldiers ensures that even military rations are meager. Their diet typically consists of barely edible scraps, boiled roots, a handful of corn, or on lucky days, small portions of rice scavenged from the countryside. Food desperation has historically driven North Korean soldiers to criminal acts, raiding civilian homes, food storage depots, and even military kitchens to steal anything edible. In one horrifying incident, 2 starving soldiers stabbed a civilian mother and daughter to death while stealing food from a kindergarten. It's desperation pushing soldiers to acts of barbarity. Even their leaders fare poorly. One source described high-ranking officers deployed to border construction projects who were so emaciated that they looked on the verge of collapse. Their gaunt appearance speaks to the near impossibility of maintaining discipline or cohesion among troops who can barely stand, let alone fight. That's probably the case with the 3 North Korean generals reportedly sent to command the troops in Russia. Now, you might think, wouldn't these horrifying conditions in their homeland make Russia look almost like a haven to them? Well, the answer might have been yes, if the North Korean troops weren't also being starved in Russia. Despite initial reports that Moscow was treating the first batch of North Korean soldiers well to attract more, those hopes faded quickly. In fact, the only thing overflowing among the troops stationed in Kursk is tension. The North Korean soldiers who were promised better conditions have voiced their dissatisfaction with the inadequate food supplies. To address the growing unrest, Russian officials were forced to intervene. Major General Mevlutov, deputy commander for resource support of the Leningrad military district, was dispatched to oversee the situation. Upon arrival in Kursk, he ordered the emergency redistribution of rations from the Russian 11th Guards Air Assault Brigade. However, while the North Korean troops didn't find sufficient food in Russia, they did find another thing: an odd form of freedom. Deploying North Korean troops to Russia plunged them into a world they are ill-equipped to navigate. Coming from one of the most isolated nations on Earth, they have little concept of the outside world, let alone modern warfare. Tanks or farming tractors, it's all the same to them, underscoring just how ignorant they are about modern military equipment. But that's not the only thing they're ignorant about. North Korean defectors spoke of their astonishment at basic amenities like electricity, running water, and proper meals when encountering other countries. And even these are just the beginning. Reports suggest that some North Korean soldiers in Russia, exposed to the internet for the first time, have spent significant downtime consuming online pornography. Yep, Putin was promised disciplined soldiers, but instead received a culture-shocked contingent that can't fight, can't think, and is dangerously out of its depth. Kim has truly pulled off a masterstroke. He disposed of his unwanted soldiers while embarrassing his supposed ally. But let's be honest, Putin is also at fault here. He might have gotten played by Kim, but he walked right into it. After all, what did he expect? That foreign soldiers with no Russian knowledge and no real-world combat experience would magically become an effective fighting force overnight? From these 2 issues alone, Putin should have known that accepting North Korean soldiers was a bad idea. Now let's talk about combat experience and where things really fall apart. North Korean troops are essentially rookies in modern combat. Their deployment in Kursk actually represents the first major battle these soldiers have seen since the Korean War in the early 1950s. That's over 70 years ago. Now don't get us wrong, North Korean soldiers have been sent abroad before, but these were small-scale deployments. During the Vietnam War, they sent fewer than 100 pilots and a psychological warfare unit. In the Yom Kippur War, they deployed 1,500 military advisors and specialists. But their numbers weren't the issue, their roles were. They were only supporting others, not on the front lines in direct combat. That's why their experience in fighting large-scale wars is practically non-existent. The same can be said for other notable North Korean foreign deployments. In the 1980s, North Korea sent just 25 military advisors to Libya, and in 1987, 50 advisors to Uganda. The most recent instance was in Syria, where North Korea sent 20 specialists, though some reports suggest it could have been more. Still, these units were far removed from the brutal realities of frontline warfare. So when Putin thought he was getting thousands of highly trained soldiers to help in the battle for Ukraine, what he got were soldiers who've been out of action for decades. But this isn't a case of bad intelligence, as the misguided invasion of Ukraine was. This was an absolute miscalculation on Putin's part. That's why he's now dealing with soldiers who have spent more time on parade than on the battlefield. And for any military operation, that's a problem you can't ignore. Another problem you can't ignore? A language barrier. This might sound trivial, but in a military setting it's a massive issue, especially when you're dealing with soldiers who already lack combat experience. Military coordination is complex and requires constant communication, precise orders, and real-time responses. So when you throw a language barrier into the mix, you get chaos, not a well-oiled machine. The North Korean soldiers in Russia are struggling to pick up Russian, with the language training reportedly limited to around 100 key military terms. That's just not enough when the stakes are this high. In a real battlefield scenario, even small misunderstandings can result in disaster. The Russians might have been able to teach them how to say attack, but without fluency, they're not going to know the tactical nuances. That's why even integrating these soldiers into Russian military units at lower levels is going to be like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. The Russians will have to rely on translators, which is hardly an ideal setup for a real-time real-time battle conditions where seconds count. So when Putin imagined North Korean soldiers seamlessly joining Russian forces, he might have overlooked one crucial detail. If these troops can't understand their commanders, they're not going to be able to execute orders properly, and their performance will be even worse than expected. Putin's humiliation grows when you realize what he actually got out of this desperate band-aid for Russia's recruitment problem: a direct hit on Russian territory. You see, Putin's decision to bring in North Korean troops has directly led to Ukraine getting the green light to launch long-range missile strikes on Russian soil. President Joe Biden was the first to authorize Kyiv to use American-supplied ATACMS to strike targets inside Russia, and British Storm Shadow and French Scalp missiles followed suit. These long-range weapons had been a sensitive issue for months, but once North Korean troops were deployed in Russia, Biden approved their use, specifically targeting Russian and North Korean forces in the Kursk region. For Putin, that means the battlefield has expanded some 186 miles into the Russian territory, and now Russia itself is under attack. The very soldiers Putin thought would help him win are now indirectly causing him to lose even more ground. What a turn of events. And Kim? Well, he's the real winner in this deal. First and foremost, he got rid of his worst soldiers, the ones who were more of a burden than a benefit to North Korea's military. Sending these troops to fight for Russia, where they're far from home and unlikely to ever return, was a perfect way to clean house. After all, we aren't talking about elite units, we're talking about expendable cannon fodder, easily sacrificed to the chaos of war. Then there's the financial gain. The Russian government reportedly pays North Korean soldiers $2,000 per month, and most of that money likely ends up in the state coffers, not with the soldiers themselves. For a nation like North Korea, which has long struggled with economic hardship and foreign currency shortages, this is a much-needed cash injection. Of course, there's also the nuclear advantage. Kim has already started leveraging the alliance with Russia to enhance North Korea's nuclear ambitions. In this regard, the Russia-North Korea pact could end up being a game-changer. Moscow's help could pave the way for Kim to enhance his nuclear weapons program and bolster the country's standing on the world stage. And if that wasn't enough, there's the military technology exchange. Russia has reportedly promised to provide North Korea with MiG-29 and Su-27 fighter jets, though these are older models. While they're not the top of the line, these jets still represent a significant boost to North Korea's air power, which could prove vital in the tense airspace above the Korean peninsula. Finally, we have strategic positioning. By aligning with Russia and increasing his military capabilities, Kim is further cementing his position in the so-called New Cold War. The geopolitical dynamics are shifting, and Pyongyang is capitalizing on the rising tensions between the US, China, and Russia. Now a new powerful triad is emerging, with China, Russia, and North Korea at its core. This triad would position Kim's regime as a significantly more influential player on the global stage. Essentially, Kim got everything he needed: the money, the military support, and the strategic leverage. And Putin paid the price. Now this raises a question: why would Putin continue putting up with this crooked alliance? It's simple, really. He has no other choice. Behind closed doors, he can get furious. He can even threaten to send North Korean soldiers back, but publicly, he must maintain the illusion of strength in this alliance. Kim has already mastered this illusion. On November 30th, 2024, Kim publicly pledged North Korea's unwavering support for Russia's war in Ukraine, stressing that his country would back Russia's efforts to defend its sovereignty and territorial integrity. This strong declaration, made during a meeting with Russia's defense minister Andrei Belyusov, was carefully crafted to help Kim maintain credibility with both Russia and his domestic audience, while publicly upholding the facade of his regime's strength. Putin too needs to act strong, despite the nasty surprise he's received. The deployment of North Korean troops is part of the ongoing narrative that Russia isn't isolated, but actively building alliances with countries like North Korea, which can project a united front in the face of Western sanctions and pressures. Ultimately, neither side will fess up to the real motivations behind their actions, because doing so would undermine their image of strength, something both leaders must maintain to avoid losing influence on the global stage. But knowing Putin, this humiliation won't go unpunished. He might not be able to hit back at Kim, but his troops, they're as good as dead. Russia is almost certainly going to use the North Korean troops as cannon fodder, a strategy designed to absorb massive losses while trying to overwhelm Ukrainian defenses through sheer numbers and brute force. This approach is a hallmark of the meat grinder tactics that Russia has relied on in various conflicts. By deploying thousands of poorly trained North Korean soldiers into the front lines, Russia can launch massive, wave-like assaults intended to overwhelm Ukrainian positions, even if it means sacrificing those soldiers in the process. Though don't expect Kim to care much about the deaths of his soldiers. His regime has consistently viewed its soldiers as expendable, so even sending them to die in Russia's war is just another sacrifice in Kim's pursuit of military and political gains. And North Korean troops have indeed started dying in Russia. On December 1st, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky mentioned in an interview with Kyodo News, a Japanese news agency, that some of the North Korean soldiers had already been killed in combat. The earliest reports indicating clashes involving North Korean troops came out in early November. According to the New York Times, the first engagement took place on November 5th, when North Korean troops, alongside Russia's 810th Separate Guards Order of Zhukov Naval Infantry Brigade, fought Ukrainian forces in the contested Kursk region. Although the skirmish was described as a limited engagement, likely intended as a probing attack to test Ukrainian defenses, it ended with a significant number of North Korean casualties, according to US and Ukrainian officials. Despite the absence of specific casualty figures, both officials, who spoke anonymously due to the sensitivity of the situation, confirmed that many North Korean soldiers were killed in this encounter. While the details remain scarce, including the number of fatalities, these deaths mark the beginning of what's likely to be a much larger toll on the North Korean forces. So who's really coming out on top here? Is Putin benefiting from this arrangement in any way, or has it only sealed his fate? And what about Kim? Will he truly get away with fooling Putin? Putin's nuclear threats have finally gone too far, and now even China is telling him to knock it off. On November 19th, Putin updated Russia's nuclear doctrine, declaring that any large attack, nuclear or conventional, could justify a Russian nuclear strike. He even warned that Russia could nuke Ukraine and its allies, like the US or UK, if they keep supporting Kyiv. It was meant to scare the West into backing down. But instead of intimidation, Putin got a slap on the wrist from China. Yes, China has had enough of Putin's reckless nuclear rhetoric and just issued its strongest warning yet. Stop threatening nukes, or there will be consequences. Coming from one of Russia's few remaining allies, this warning is a major blow to Putin's image and his already shaky relationship with Beijing. So why is China so fed up? And what does this mean for Russia's future? Let's get into it. We begin with the warning. On November 4th, Politico reported that Chinese President Xi Jinping had levied his most direct criticism of Putin's special military operation yet. This initial warning came just a couple of weeks before Russia made its new nuclear doctrine official, but it seems Xi may have had an inkling of what was coming. Xi told Putin that he shouldn't resort to using nuclear weapons to topple Ukraine. He even called on Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor, to push for peace talks between Ukraine and Russia as soon as possible. In a statement published by Xinhua, which is China's state news agency, Xi said that the entire international community must jointly oppose the use of or the threats to use nuclear weapons. He added that the entire world should advocate that nuclear weapons cannot be used, a nuclear war cannot be waged, in order to prevent a nuclear crisis. On the surface, that seems like a fairly general call to all nuclear-capable nations to simmer down. However, Russia is the only nation capable of launching nuclear strikes that is making threats right now. So it's easy to see this as Xi indirectly sending a message to Putin that he needs to calm down on the rhetoric. Xi didn't go so far as to tell Putin that it was time to withdraw, but again, the indirect nature of the Chinese approach comes through. Xi's call for Scholz to oversee peace talks is another veiled message to Putin that it's about time he ended his special military operation. These veiled warnings showed that Beijing was becoming increasingly wary of Putin's apparent desire to rely on Russia's vast nuclear arsenal to get its way. But as we now know, Putin didn't listen. By November 19th, he had a new doctrine in place that served as a clear threat to the US, UK, and France, all nuclear-capable nations, that he would launch against them and Ukraine if he felt pushed to do so. President Xi wasn't happy. And that's what pushed Beijing to issue its final warning to Russia. On November 29th, 10 days after Putin made Russia's new doctrine official, the Chinese Foreign Ministry held a press conference through which spokesperson Mao Ning made China's nuclear position clear. China is paying close attention to the nuclear risks triggered by the Ukraine crisis and has reiterated time and again that nuclear weapons should not be used and nuclear war must not be fought, she said. Mao added that China is encouraging all parties to remain calm and exercise restraint amidst reports that the US is considering returning nuclear weapons to Ukraine as part of a deterrent measure against Russia. Joint efforts are needed to cool down the situation through dialogue and consultation to reduce strategic risks. Through these two warnings, we see China trying to maintain its supposedly neutral standpoint in relation to the war. Only that maintenance is tinged with a little fear. Perhaps Beijing believes that Putin is starting to teeter over the edge with this latest round of nuclear threats. And if that's the case, China doesn't want to even consider being on the side of the country that plunges the rest of the world into a nuclear war. Will the Kremlin listen to China's concerns? It may have to. After all, China is believed to have expressed its desire for Putin to rein in his nuclear rhetoric as far back as July 2023. That's the month that The Guardian reported that Xi had held a private conversation with Putin during a state visit to Moscow in which he urged Russia's leader against using nuclear weapons in Ukraine. At the time, the Kremlin was quick to dispel these rumors. "No, I can't confirm it," Putin mouthpiece Dmitry Peskov said, when reporters asked if Xi had delivered an anti-nuclear message during his trip to Moscow. But that denial doesn't mean much. Russia uses propaganda and subterfuge to try and subvert any news that it doesn't like entering the media. The odds are that Xi did deliver a warning back in July 2023 to Putin behind closed doors. Russia didn't listen. Now, China is going a lot more public with its warnings, meaning Russia can no longer claim not to have received or heard them. It's a very clever move by Beijing. Its warnings let Russia know exactly where it stands on the nuclear issue. They also allow China to loosely align itself with the Western powers being threatened by Russia's new doctrine in calling for Putin to de-escalate. China has gone public with its warnings to Putin. That leaves us with some questions. Why has it chosen now to deliver that final warning, and what does this mean for Russia and its relationship with China going forward? It's here where things get a little complicated. In the immediate sense, China issuing its anti-nuclear warnings to Russia suggests that there's at least a slim prospect that Putin will lose China's support if he continues down this nuclear warpath. That may seem like a strange claim to make, seeing as the two countries have previously proclaimed that they have a no-limits partnership. However, there were already signs that this partnership was struggling long before China delivered its final warning to Putin. For instance, a joint statement released by China and Russia in May 2024 conveniently omitted any mention of the supposed no-limits partnership between the pair. That was notable given that the statement commemorated the 75th anniversary of the two countries establishing diplomatic relations. Putin's visit to Beijing in May 2024 also offered hints that the relationship between the countries is starting to get frosty. Putin enthusiastically claimed that he and Xi were as close as brothers during the visit. Xi, on the other hand, called Putin a good friend and a good neighbor. A positive statement, of course, but it's telling that Xi doesn't consider Putin a brother, but rather a friend. It's a lot easier to break ties with friends than it is with family. All of these little signs of splits in the relationship are bad news for Russia. That's especially the case given that Russia has been relying on China as one of its major trade partners in the wake of the sanctions the West has placed against it since February 2022. Two-way trade between the countries was $240 billion in 2023. It seems like 2024 is going to have similar levels, with Reuters reporting that trade between the two amounted to $202.2 billion between January and October 2024. It's also worth noting that China had been providing Russia with dual-use components for most of Putin's special military operation. These are components that typically have commercial purposes, but can also be used militarily. Through this clever version of trading, China has managed to stop short of sending weapons to Russia while giving Putin what he needs to build his own equipment. All of this is trade that Russia desperately needs given its ailing economy and its flagging military. And it's trade that might disappear entirely if Putin follows through on his nuclear threats. After all, China being an established ally of a nuclear weapon launching Russia would mean its trade with the West would take a massive hit. Xi's warnings to Putin thus carry a financial element. Stop with the nuclear rhetoric, or China may be forced to take the billions of dollars it's pumping into Russia's economy elsewhere. That's worrying enough for Putin. But as concerning is the fact that Russia's new nuclear doctrine is at complete odds with how China approaches its nuclear weapons. In Putin's perfect world, he'd be able to rely on China to bolster his nuclear threat against the West. Not that his threat needs much bolstering. As of July 2024, Russia maintains a nuclear arsenal of 5,580, according to the Arms Control Association. Around 1,500 of those nukes are strategically deployed, with 4,380 tactical nukes and 1,200 in the midst of being retired, making up the numbers. Still, adding China's 500 nuclear weapons to that tally, along with the extra 1,000 it's anticipated to build between now and 2035, would add even more credence to Putin's nuclear threats. The problem is that China's nuclear philosophy doesn't match Russia's. China maintains a no-first-use policy, meaning it will absolutely refuse to use nuclear weapons unless another country attacks it with nukes first. It's had that policy since it became nuclear capable in 1964, and reaffirmed it as recently as July 2024. In fact, China is one of only 2 nuclear nations, along with India, to have this sort of policy in place. Think about what it means in the context of Russia's new nuclear doctrine. Putin now permits himself to use nukes in the case of large-scale conventional weapons strikes as well as nuclear attacks. He's willing to attack non-nuclear nations like Ukraine. His doctrine also says that Russia reserves the right to launch preemptive strikes if its systems pick up on even a hint of a nuclear missile being sent its way. These are all policies that China diametrically opposes, and Beijing wants no part of working with a nation that would launch nukes and ask questions later. There are clear philosophical differences about the nature of nuclear weapons and their usage between China and Russia. That casts an interesting light on China's final warning to Russia. It's telling Putin that it doesn't support his new doctrine, and that it may be willing to withdraw from their partnership if he follows through on his threats against Ukraine and the West. Xi will hope that this will be enough to convince Putin to back off from his nuclear threats. After all, it was only in January 2022 that China, Russia, the US, France, and Great Britain published a joint statement saying a nuclear war should be avoided. The Kremlin published that statement, according to Reuters. It saw all five say, "We affirm that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. As nuclear use would have far-reaching consequences, we also affirm that nuclear weapons, for as long as they continue to exist, should serve defensive purposes, deter aggression, and prevent war." A little over a month later, Putin launched his special military operation. And so much of what's come out of his mouth in the nearly 3 years that have followed runs counter to the spirit of this joint statement. China clearly wants Russia to stop making nuclear threats, and it's getting closer and closer to limiting its support of Russia to make Putin see the light. So we see philosophical differences and signs of splintering in China's relationship with Russia that were forebears to Beijing's final warning. China may be subtly indicating that it's going to end its relationship with Russia if Putin launches a nuke. But there's another side of this coin. China is concerned about Russia, of that there is no doubt, but it's also concerned for itself. After all, its closeness to Russia means that it will essentially be treated as an accomplice by the West if Putin uses nukes. That's something that Beijing simply can't afford. And again, there are signs that China is wary of how the West would respond if Russia launches a nuke. Take what's happening in the Indo-Pacific as an example. The second half of 2024 has seen the United States strengthen its extended deterrence policies with Japan and South Korea. The US met with both in September, with each meeting leading to a reaffirmation and expansion of the commitments that all three have made to create regional stability in the Indo-Pacific. That's worrying for China. These extended deterrence agreements place South Korea and Japan under the protection of America's nuclear umbrella, which minimizes China's ability to be the Indo-Pacific's big power player through its own nuclear arsenal. In short, Beijing is already worried about Washington's increasing presence in a region it hopes to control. With Putin making nuclear threats while still ostensibly allied to China, he's only giving the United States more reasons to strengthen its defensive commitments around the world, including in the Indo-Pacific. Basically, if Putin carries on the way he is, China will have to deal with an even larger American presence than it currently has in its region. Xi's warning to Putin gains another component. He's not just telling Russia to stop with its nuclear threats due to philosophical differences, he's also warning Putin that his nuclear threats are causing more problems for China. That's not good news for an already slowly fracturing relationship, with China being more likely to abandon Russia than it is to sit back and allow Putin's policies to affect its position in the Indo-Pacific. Other American policies will also concern China, especially when it comes to sanctions. The United States and its Western partners have used sanctions to great effect against Russia. Castellum says that the West placed 19,535 sanctions on Russia, in addition to 2,695 it had in place before the war, between February 2022 and August 2024. More have followed. The most recent batch of US sanctions affects Russian banks that deal with international transactions, including those the country relies upon to handle key oil and gas sales. That move has been devastating for Russia's economy, as highlighted by the ruble cratering to a new low of 114 against the US dollar on November 27th. Russia has relied on China to work around these sanctions for much of the war, but Beijing hasn't escaped unscathed from this decision. Back in May 2024, the United States imposed sanctions on over a dozen Chinese companies that it believed were supporting Putin's war in Ukraine. It also announced new export restrictions that will affect China's ability to create its own advanced semiconductors, providing more evidence of America's increasing interest in the Indo-Pacific region. China is also facing up to the prospect of dealing with extensive tariffs when President-elect Donald Trump takes office in January 2025. Of course, Beijing isn't happy with Washington over these sanctions and tariffs, but it also knows that it's being targeted in part because of China's relationship with Russia. Outgoing US Secretary of State Antony Blinken made that much clear during his April 2024 visit to Beijing when he accused China of helping to fuel the biggest threat to Europe's security since the days of the Cold War. That wasn't an idle claim. The US truly believes that China is causing more problems than it's solving by working so closely with Russia, and it's willing to use sanctions and tariffs to curtail that relationship. China will obviously take note of all this. And with Putin's nuclear doctrine changes, it'll also know that Europe's security situation is even more fragile than it was when Blinken made his April claim. A Russia that keeps moving closer to the nuclear button is one that puts China at risk of even worse sanctions and tariffs. That's simply something that China cannot afford. After all, America is an even bigger trading partner for China than Russia. In 2023, two-way trade between the US and China typically sat at around $45 billion per month, hitting a high of $57.62 billion in October. If we assume a conservative $45 billion per month figure, that means two-way trade exceeded $500 billion last year, around $260 billion more than two-way trade between Russia and China. Statista's figures for the first 9 months of 2024 suggest that the monthly average between the US and China will be even higher. The two countries cracked $51 billion 3 months in a row between July and September 2024, with the festive period likely to see those numbers rise even higher. Why does that matter? It shows us that the United States is a far more valuable trade partner to China than Russia has ever been. And it's not even close. Trade with the US is around double that with Russia for Beijing. If Putin's nuclear doctrine and his constant threats don't stop, China may be forced to face the prospect of the US cutting back on that trade. That already seems like the case with looming tariffs. But Xi will hope that this final warning to Putin will be enough to allow China to negotiate a better deal with Trump when the president-elect enters office. Simply put, Putin is screwing up China's most lucrative relationship. Xi can't have that, so he's warning Putin to stay away from the nukes. It's also why China has steered clear of the cooperative defense pact Russia has created with North Korea. That pact makes China uneasy. While Russia and North Korea deepen their ties, vowing to resist what they call the US-led West in the process, China is more worried about its influence. It sees Russia encroaching, undermining its own ability to coerce North Korea into actions it prefers. What's clear here is that Beijing is starting to see Russia as a threat. Putin's nuclear rhetoric and his new doctrine make Xi uneasy because both run counter to how China approaches nuclear weapons. China is also very wary of worsening its shaky relationship with the US over Russia's actions. Whether Xi would say it or not, China needs American trade so much that it can't afford to take Putin's side. That's why it's delivered its final warning, albeit one loaded with implications, to Russia. Stop the nuclear threats, or Beijing will have to pull away from Moscow. Still, there's one more possibility that we have to consider. All of this posturing from Beijing could merely be a smokescreen to distract from the fact that China actually does support Russia in its nuclear approach. That's the argument put forth by The Coming Collapse of China author Gordon G. Chang in an opinion piece published by The Hill. Chang says that China's support of Russia throughout Putin's special military operation is indicative of two nations that still have very strong ties. China's nuclear admonishments are merely surface level, Chang suggests, because Xi sees in Putin a man who's bold enough to do what he can't do himself, disrupt the Western-led international system. Chang says China and Russia see the world in the same way. They've also both identified the United States as their enemy, meaning there's a possibility that China would choose Russia over the US regardless of the trade implications. Chang also points to China making nuclear threats of its own in recent years. When Japan said that it would defend Taiwan against a Chinese invasion in July 2021, Xi broke out the nuclear rhetoric. He did the same when Australia joined AUKUS alongside the US and UK a month later. Make no mistake, China's president is not immune to throwing China's nuclear weight around when he feels it's necessary. The difference between Xi and Putin is that Xi seems to understand that he is merely postulating that his enemy's actions might lead to nuclear war. Putin is outright saying it while putting the mechanisms in place to allow him to launch nuclear warheads in non-nuclear circumstances. That's a massive concern to a Chinese president who has ambitions to influence global geopolitics in his own way. It's also the reason China delivered its final warning to Putin. But what do you think about the relationship between China and Russia right now? Has Putin's new nuclear doctrine driven a wedge between the two nations that can't be removed? Will we see President Xi do an about-face on his support for Putin if Russia's leader leans even more heavily into his nuclear posturing? China's patience with Russia is running out. With North Korean troops now on Russian soil, Beijing isn't happy, and this unexpected alliance could shake up the entire conflict in Ukraine. On October 18, 2024, South Korean intelligence dropped a bombshell. North Korea had sent about 1,500 troops to Russia to support its war efforts in Ukraine. But according to Ukrainian intelligence, that was just the beginning. The real number may be closer to 10,000, with North Korean engineers and equipment joining the mix. Their mission: to help Russia optimize North Korean weaponry for the modern battlefield. While the West is already alarmed by these developments, China's reaction is equally surprising. As Russia's lifeline through sanctions, China has kept Putin's economy afloat and has quietly supported Moscow from the sidelines. But the idea of North Korean troops stationed so close to China's border could be pushing Beijing's loyalty to its limit. So what's really driving China's unease? Will this surprising alliance push Beijing to rethink its stance on the war in Ukraine? With Xi Jinping's next move a mystery, the stakes have never been higher. But why would China's leader be so alarmed by North Korean troops entering the picture? As it turns out, there are some big reasons, and they could change everything. First, the reports of North Korean soldiers on Russian territory suggest that Russia is willing to call on other countries for direct military aid in the war. Russia justifies this action by implying that these soldiers would only be used to reinforce the Russian border, rather than being deployed to the front lines in Ukraine. That would be in line with the June Mutual Defense Agreement between the two nations. The agreement states that the countries are required to come to the other's aid when their territory is threatened. For Russia, this only became an issue in August 2024, when Ukraine launched its invasion of the Kursk region. This was a major morale boost for the Ukrainians and seen as a strategic victory at the time. It showed that they could present a real threat to Russia's own territory, even with only the limited supplies of advanced Western military equipment that they had been provided. The Kremlin's response to the Kursk invasion started off relatively muted, with what seemed to be little progress in reinforcing the region during the 3 weeks when Ukraine was pushing deeper into Russian territory. The counteroffensive only started in September, nearly a month after Ukraine pushed into the region. Since then, like in Donbass, they've been grimly, steadily grinding the Ukrainians back. By the time that reports of North Korean soldiers arriving on the Kursk front lines started surfacing, Russia had regained control of roughly half of the occupied territory in Kursk. With the slow progress in Kursk, it does make sense to deploy more troops to reinforce the border, both to prevent new incursions and to stop reinforcements arriving in Kursk. However, in the bigger picture of the war, Russia has pushed on with its offensive in Donbass throughout the Kursk incursion. So these troops that would supposedly be set up on the border probably wouldn't end up doing much. Even if Ukraine did try to snag another bit of Russian territory, that's not likely to be their focus in the near future. Ukraine needs its manpower most in the Donbass region, where the Russian forces are pushing ever deeper into Ukrainian territory at a speed not seen since the very beginning of the war. Additionally, Russia has been conscripting soldiers through mandatory military service for more than 30 months now. Even if that military service lasts only a year, recent estimates suggest that the Russian military has conscripted roughly 160,000 new soldiers every 6 months. That's a reserve of 300,000 troops. And according to Russian law, conscripts can't be deployed abroad. This means that Putin already has plenty of his own troops to reinforce Russia's borders. Unless those troops are not nearly as well trained as they should be. This is supported by interrogations of conscripts taken as prisoners of war in Kursk by the Ukrainian military. According to some recruits, they were given only a few weeks of basic training and then shipped to their posts. So the North Koreans should be better trained than Russian conscripts. After all, North Korea has an 8-year mandatory military service period for men and 5 for women. But there are a few issues with that assumption. Firstly, the troops from North Korea are unlikely to have been trained in modern combat tactics, including the long-range drone warfare that's become such a prominent feature of the ongoing war. That means that they are unlikely to fare much better than Russia's own conscripts in the grand scheme of the war. Secondly, there are doubts that North Korea would actually send their top troops to another country, regardless of any geopolitical pressure to defend Russia's territorial integrity. It's far more likely that the soldiers sent to Russia were meant to perform the same role as conscripts or fresh recruits in the Russian military so far – cannon fodder. So if the troops aren't going to make a significant difference, why is China not happy about them being there? Well, Putin's reasoning for calling these men to defend the Russian border doesn't really make sense logically. If they're only going to be called to defend the border, the West might decide to do the same thing in Ukraine. If NATO decided to send well-armed troops to Ukraine to honor the country's territorial integrity, this would have the same result as Putin's own moves. NATO and Ukraine, of course, don't have a signed mutual defense pact like Russia and North Korea do, so this would be a serious escalation. No doubt Putin would likely make more nuclear threats, but this would certainly be crossing yet another of the red lines that he has frequently drawn over the past 33 months. But if Putin decides that the soldiers from North Korea were not going to be stationed defensively, but used offensively inside Ukraine, then all bets would be off. With a third country officially joining the conflict, the special military operation would devolve into a war that could escalate through many countries and regions. We could see direct conflict between NATO and Russia, plus of course the North Koreans. If this were to happen, it would leave China with a difficult choice. China has had its own mutual defense pact with North Korea since 1961. If NATO attacked North Korea, it would be obliged to come to its allies' defense. If China doesn't join Russia in the expanded war, most experts believe Russia is pretty much bound to lose a non-nuclear conflict against the combined forces of NATO. If NATO were to conquer Russia, China would stand to lose out on the cheap Russian resources upon which it depends heavily. These include oil, gas, and other natural resources like drinking water, minerals, and timber, which all come from Siberia. The resource-starved industry and water-demanding population centers of northern China would plunge into crisis. But if, on the other hand, China does join the war, its economy might not be able to support the effort. The US holds control over the Strait of Malacca, through which most of the naval trade between China and Europe, Africa, and the Middle East must pass. If China entered the war, the US would likely be called upon to take control of the Far Eastern front of the conflict. Then, the war could propagate to include the other members of the Quad, Japan, Australia, and India. The US and its allies in the Indo-Pacific could in effect blockade China from accessing the Indian Ocean and might be able to block off other naval routes through the East China Sea. China would be left with land corridors only to trade with Central Asia and reach ports in the Middle East and Persian Gulf. There would be heavy sanctions and embargoes. Railroads and highways are quite easy targets for NATO. China's economy might quickly collapse, especially if the war dragged on. But there's a third option. China might go to war against Russia itself. While the two countries are for all intents and purposes full allies, they weren't on such friendly terms throughout most of history. During the 19th century, Imperial China lost huge swathes of its territory to other countries, Russia included. Today's region of Outer Manchuria, which makes up most of the eastern part of the Sino-Russian border and connects Russia to North Korea, was taken from China by Russia during that time. While China has not made official claims on the territory, recent maps by the Chinese Ministry of Natural Resources have relabeled all major cities in Outer Manchuria with their historical Chinese names. Additionally, China has stated all international maps should use those names. So why is Outer Manchuria so important for China? Apart from being a natural extension of one of the most densely populated regions of China, control of Outer Manchuria would open the door for China to take the entire Siberia and Russian Far East along with it. Due to the harsh conditions, Russia has relatively little control or infrastructure in the region, and it's sparsely populated. The two largest cities only have around 400,000 people each. But Outer Manchuria and Siberia are abundant in the natural resources that China sorely needs for its industry. Lake Baikal alone could supply the country with fresh drinking water for decades. When Chinese companies made plans to purchase the land surrounding the lake, the Russian government was forced to step in and pull the rug on the project amidst local protests. And that's exactly where the North Korean troops might come in. Rather than using them to defend Russia against Ukraine, Putin might use North Korea to create a buffer zone against China. With Outer Manchuria bordering North Korea, the logistics of transporting troops en masse to the region are significantly simpler than posting them in Kursk or other regions close to Ukraine. But why would North Korea agree to this? They have a mutual defense pact with China too, don't they? Well, while North Korea has been sending military equipment, including missiles and artillery shells to Russia, Russia has been sending food and other products to North Korea in response. The specifics of the trade between the two countries aren't published by either country, but trade appears to have grown considerably in recent years. On the other hand, China has become more critical of North Korea's provocative actions over the past decade. China has even expressed mixed feelings about the deepening ties between Russia and North Korea, citing concerns about the potential impact on regional security and its own relations with Pyongyang. So if North Korea has indeed grown heavily dependent on Russia as opposed to China in recent years, then it might very well decide that the risk is worth the reward, especially if it's being leaned on hard by Putin. And the North Korean military is anything but small. Thanks to its mandatory military service requirements, it's estimated that the country could draft around 8 million people in the event of a conflict. But even without these reserves, the active military personnel of North Korea is around 1.4 million people, which equals the size of the US's military and Russia's, if their numbers are to be believed. And with North Korea mobilizing, South Korea is likely to rapidly gear up its national defense capabilities too. Relations between the two are already as strained and tense as they have been in decades. At a minimum, South Korea would work against China on the same axis as Japan and the US, cutting off access to the East China Sea. That's why the North Korean troops in Russia are leaving China with no good options. Perhaps the best option is to wait and see what actually happens with these troops. According to some reports, some of them have already deserted their posts, using their deployment in Russia as an opportunity to leave North Korea entirely. But whatever happens, the mere presence of North Korean troops says something about the current state of the war. It suggests that Russia is starting to exhaust itself as a result of the war effort. For the past 2.5 years, China has been betting that Russia would win the war, at least eventually. By signing extensive and highly lucrative trade deals with Russia, China was able to gain much more from Russia being at war than otherwise. And when Russia won, China would reap the rewards of the former's expanded territory, population, and industry. It would be able to fuel its own industry and leverage Russia's access to showcase the waning influence of the West, thereby strengthening its own position in global geopolitics. But if Russia loses the war, there's no telling what might happen with its government. The alliance between Russia and China appears to be built around the strong personal relationship between Xi and Putin and their regimes. If Putin loses the war in Ukraine, he might be forced out of office, and the next government might decide to, or be compelled to, pivot back towards the West. This would be a mortal blow to the so-called equal, orderly, multipolar world that China is trying to build with itself at the head of the table. In the end, China might be thinking that Russia is finally starting to crumble, both externally and internally. If it were to collapse, it might be able to swoop in, take Siberia and its resources, and profit greatly. But if North Korea keeps defending Russia, then that plan might go out of the window, and China would be forced to keep supporting a failing nation, and that's not something that China would have much incentive to do. But what do you think? Will China take an official stance on North Korea joining the war in Ukraine? In the early days of the People's Republic of China, the PRC, the nation was almost a satellite state, overshadowed by the might of the Soviet Union. So much so that Mao Zedong, whom China revered as a fearless leader, was treated as nothing more than a puppet on Joseph Stalin's string, a humiliated figure relegated to the sidelines during his visit to Moscow in 1949. But if there's one thing that China is hell-bent on achieving, it's correcting historical humiliations and regaining its rightful place on the world stage. In the case of the Soviet Union, or now Russia, China had to wait some 70 years for the tables to turn. But boy did they turn. Now China holds the better cards in the Moscow-Beijing relationship. The country that was once China's domineering overlord has now become its lapdog, eager to please and gain favor. But how did this happen? How did the power dynamic between Beijing and Moscow shift so drastically? Stick around and you'll find out. But to understand just how drastic this power dynamic switch has been, we must first travel back in time to the previously mentioned early days of the People's Republic of China. The PRC was founded in October 1949. Just 2 months later, Mao traveled to Moscow to meet with Stalin, then the leader of the Soviet Union. This meeting was crucial for the newly established People's Republic of China, as it sought recognition and support from the Soviet Union, a major world power and the leader of the communist bloc. Now, judging by the hearty military march performed in Mao's honor on this occasion, he had nothing to worry about. After all, the opening line of Moskva-Peking, or Moscow-Beijing, a song written to celebrate China and Russia's relationship, loudly proclaimed that Russians and Chinese are brothers forever. Yet Stalin did not treat Mao as a brother. He treated him as a subordinate. For starters, he didn't even welcome him immediately. Instead, Stalin shipped Mao off to his snowbound seasonal home, located 17 miles outside of Moscow. There, he couldn't do anything but wait for Stalin while complaining about virtually everything, from the quality of the fish he was served to the discomfort of the mattress he slept on. Weeks later, when Stalin finally granted Mao an audience, he had little interest in Mao's ideas and plans for China. Instead, Stalin focused on asserting Soviet dominance and reportedly even lecturing Mao on Marxist theory. He then strong-armed his way into a highly advantageous arms deal that had China borrowing money from the Soviet Union to purchase the country's weapons. Worst of all, the borrowed money was to be paid back with hefty interest. This first meeting undoubtedly set the tone for the relationship between these two countries and their leaders for years. While Stalin was alive, he was the teacher, the titan of the communist movement, as one author puts it. Naturally, this made Mao nothing more than his student. Though to be fair, Mao did learn a thing or two from Stalin. He copied many of the Soviet leaders' ruthless tactics, consolidating his power through purges, propaganda, and authoritarian control. These two leaders had another thing in common: an ever-growing disdain for the West. That's also what kept Russia and China together throughout history, despite all their differences and conflicts. One of these differences lies in how these nations continued growing and developing after their initial alignment. China has undoubtedly done a superior job of building its economy and becoming a global powerhouse. Russia, on the other hand, hasn't, not even close. The country pursued an empire-building foreign policy that only managed to strain its resources and hinder its economic progress. Russia was no longer China's big brother, but rather a struggling neighbor, unable to match China's economic influence. But don't get it twisted, Russia was still a force to be reckoned with, far from being anyone's pet. So what brought Russia to its knees before China, transforming it into a mere shadow of its former self? The answer is simple: the war in Ukraine. After mercilessly invading Ukraine, Russia was shunned by much of the Western world. In fact, having faced a barrage of sanctions, harsh criticism in international media, and exclusion from global cultural events, it appeared Russia was all alone. But it wasn't. It still had one powerful ally left: China. Of course, this allyship would come to cost Russian President Vladimir Putin quite a lot, more than just his wounded pride. You see, Russia has become significantly dependent on China's economic, political, and technological support. In other words, China has now become the dominant partner in the relationship. The student has become the master. Let's see how Russia's dependency on China materialized. First up, Russian exports. Just a few short years ago, Russia was a major exporter of oil and gas to Europe. We're talking about a total energy export of over $150 billion. Germany alone imported about 15% of the total figure. That's roughly $23 billion in crude oil, gasoline, and diesel. However, after Putin made the disastrous decision to invade Ukraine, the relationship between Russia and Europe soured. What followed were sanctions that included restrictions on energy imports. Naturally, these restrictions drilled a huge hole in Russia's budget, a hole that forced Russia to pivot its export focus to China. Now it's undeniable that China had previously sought new energy resources to fuel its rapid economic growth. However, with this new dynamic, something else fell into Beijing's lap: a massive leverage over Moscow. China was now in the position to decide how much it wanted to buy, thus holding the reins and exerting influence over Russia. For now, the country has been pretty generous in its dealings with Russia. We'll let the numbers speak for themselves. In 2022, crude oil imports to China reached 1.82 million barrels a day, a 42.5% increase from the 800,000 barrels Russia exported to this country in 2021. And that was just the beginning. In March 2024, this figure reached a staggering 2.55 million barrels per day, more than doubling the 2022 numbers. The fact that Russia almost exclusively counts on China to keep its oil imports afloat is bad enough. The fact that this oil is sold at a hefty discount from global benchmarks adds insult to injury. But it's not like Russia has a choice. The same can be said for Russian gas exports. China holds all the cards there as well. Shortly before the invasion of Ukraine, Russia signed a deal with China, agreeing to boost its natural gas supply to the country. In 2020, China received only 4.1 billion cubic meters of Russian gas. With this new deal, the figure was to rise to 48 billion by 2025. Around the same time, Russia started planning the construction of the Power of Siberia 2, a new 1,865-mile-long pipeline that would further increase the capacity to supply natural gas to China and deepen Russia's economic ties to the country in the process. However, oil and gas aren't the only commodities driving Russia's dependence on China. The total trade turnover between the countries has been on a steady rise since 2022. For comparison's sake, this turnover was around $107 billion in 2018. In 2022, it was $190 billion. In 2023, it was around $240, a 26% jump. In 2024, this figure might grow by another 15%. Talk about a booming relationship. Another way Russia has bowed down to China was by embracing the country's official currency, the renminbi, in several areas. One of them is the stock exchange. The Chinese currency dethroned the US dollar to become the most traded foreign currency on the Moscow Stock Exchange, with roughly 42% of transactions now conducted in the renminbi. Another is Russia's reserve currency. According to some estimates, Russia's reserves were valued at over $600 billion before the invasion. Post-invasion, half of these reserves have been immobilized in the West. A huge chunk of them has also been used to support Kremlin's war effort. In this chaos, Russia's central bank had no choice but to turn to the renminbi as its reserve currency. By now, you can clearly see a pattern of behavior. Step 1. Russia has no other viable alternatives. Step 2. Russia turns to China. Step 3. China now has major leverage over Russia. It's precisely this 1-2-3 sequence of events that has turned Russia into China's pet. Though to be fair, Russia's reliance on the renminbi can also be explained as part of the rising de-dollarization movement. Russia was joined in this movement by BRICS initial members, Brazil, India, China, and South Africa, with the goal of reducing their dependency on the US dollar and ultimately diminishing Washington's economic influence. That's why Russia now uses the renminbi to settle 25% of its international trade and 75% of its dealings with China. But this doesn't change the fact that China now holds significant sway over Russia's economic decisions. The same applies to the country's military decisions. But how so? Well, the war in Ukraine has been wreaking havoc on Russia's defense capabilities. And who's been helping the country with this mess? You guessed it, China. China has been a tremendous support while Russia is ramping up its defense capabilities. So much so that Moscow is currently undertaking the most ambitious military manufacturing expansion since the Soviet era. But what exactly is China's role in all this? It's the same role China assumed for many countries worldwide. China is the supplier. As the leading supplier for the Russian military complex, China provides a significant chunk of components necessary for Russia's military production. This includes everything from machine tools to drone and turbojet engineers. It also includes nitrocellulose, which Russia's military uses to produce large quantities of artillery rounds. However, large might be an understatement, as Russia is on track to produce 3 times more artillery shells than the entire US and Europe are producing for Ukraine. Currently, the country is producing about 250,000 artillery munitions per month. If we crunch the numbers, this comes out to 3 million a year. Together, the US and Europe can only generate about 1.2 million artillery munitions to send to Ukraine. Russia is also dependent on China's microelectronics, which are used to power its advanced military systems. As many as 90% of these microelectronics were sourced from China in 2023. China is also supplying technology to Russia. After all, the country did spend years stealing Western technology through various means, so why not share the booty with its down-on-its-luck partner? Of course, China's President Xi Jinping isn't doing this from the goodness of his heart. Personal interest has fueled every single one of his actions, but more on that later. For now, let's focus on the other ways Russia has benefited from China militarily. So, China is helping Russia produce new weapons. However, it also sells sophisticated military equipment directly to Russia. However, there's an important caveat: no lethal weaponry. The US warned China against selling these types of weapons since the beginning of the war in Ukraine. It seems that China has heeded these warnings so far, well, officially at least. After all, we are dealing with 2 of the world's most secretive countries here. But China is sticking to the no-lethal weaponry story, so let's give it the benefit of the doubt. In February 2024, the country reaffirmed this commitment when China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi spoke at the Munich Security Conference in Germany. According to reports, he assured his Ukrainian counterpart, Dmytro Kuleba, that Beijing isn't selling lethal weapons to Russia for its war against Ukraine. So what is China selling to Russia? Mostly military vehicles and drones. In the first year or so of the Ukrainian invasion, Russia purchased $32 million worth of Chinese drones from manufacturers like DJI Technology and Autel. In December 2023, Russia bought 500 Chinese Desert Cross 1003 all-terrain vehicles, or ATVs, manufactured by Shandong Odess Industry. Reportedly, these 500 units were added to Russia's existing lineup of about 500 basic models of this vehicle. It also plans to acquire 1,000 more of these ATVs. But the fact these aren't lethal weapons doesn't make China's dealings with Russia any less worrisome. After all, supplying components and technology for lethal weapons is almost as impactful, if not more so, in the long run. That's why the US has been taking steps to curb China's ability to supply such components to Russia. In December 2023, the US Department of Treasury sanctioned a network of entities and individuals based in China for their involvement in facilitating transactions of Chinese-manufactured weapons and technologies to Russia. The list of these sanctioned individuals and entities only keeps growing as Russia amps up its military production. Paradoxically, while supporting Russia's war effort directly and indirectly, China is also trying to assume the role of the peacemaker between the 2 countries. Initially, Xi's peace initiative consisted of 12 points aimed at de-escalating the conflict and finding a diplomatic solution. However, these points were vague at best and mostly served to promote China as a peace-loving global power. So it's no wonder this initiative was ill-received by both Ukraine and the West. The new 4-point peace plan from April 2024 doesn't look any more promising. According to China, this plan is no longer vague. Listen to the 4 mentioned principles and see whether you agree. Number 1. Focusing on peace and stability rather than selfish gains. Number 2. Cooling down the situation in Ukraine rather than adding fuel to the fire. Number 3. Establishing conditions for restoring peace rather than aggravating the situation. Number 4. Reducing the negative impact of the war on the world economy. Not exactly the Treaty of Versailles, is it? Both plans are nothing more than a clumsy way to show the world China can resolve a major conflict. Though let's be honest, these performative plans probably couldn't even resolve the conflict between 2 neighbors fighting over a fence. But China is probably content with how things currently stand. After all, the situation in Ukraine is what brought such a radical shift in the power dynamics between China and Russia. And let us tell you, China has gotten quite a few concessions in this ordeal. Arguably, one of the most significant concessions is access to the Arctic. You see, Russia is an Arctic nation, owning some 15,000 miles of the Arctic Ocean coastline. China, on the other hand, isn't. Well, at least territorially. In spirit, China pretty much considers itself an Arctic nation, or a near-Arctic nation, to be precise, which is what Xi proclaimed China to be in 2018. Before the invasion of Ukraine, Russia, which considers the Arctic its backyard, wasn't too happy about China trying to jump the fence. Though the sentiment might not have changed after the invasion, Russia no longer has the luxury of saying no to China's Arctic ambitions. After all, it was shunned there too, with the remaining Arctic nations refusing to cooperate with Russia in the Arctic Council. Let's review the 1-2-3 pattern. 1. Russia is completely isolated. 2. Russia turns to China. 3. China is now heavily involved in the Arctic development projects. Of course, after spending years trying to find an in, China welcomed this opportunity with open arms. With this opportunity also comes access to unprecedented mineral reserves, plentiful energy resources, and crucial maritime routes. Talk about striking gold. Another concession Russia made to China has to do with weapon exports to India. You see, China and India have had their fair share of bloody border disputes. On the Indian side, most of these disputes were fought with Russian weapons, as the country was the #1 arms importer for India for a long time. Beijing did try to get Moscow to cut arms sales to India during this period, but Moscow didn't want to hear it. After all, who is China to dictate who Russia can and can't sell weapons to? Well, the days of asking this prideful question are certainly gone. India has seemingly also taken the hint, slashing its arms procurement from Russia in more than half, much to China's satisfaction. This sentiment has undoubtedly spread to other areas of cooperation between Russia and China, since there's virtually no area where Russia hasn't made some sort of concession. For instance, in October 2023, Russia signed a nearly desperate grain agreement with China to contain Ukraine's exports to the country. The agreement is worth around $25.7 billion and obliges Russia to provide 70 million tons of grain, legumes, and oilseeds over 12 years. This and other humiliating one-sided concessions signal that Moscow is desperate to tether Beijing closer, doing anything it can to retain its favor. Well, for now, at least. But will Russia be able to handle this dynamic for long? Can Putin, a leader driven by unyielding pride, truly be content serving as a compliant puppet to China's strategic ambitions? You probably already know the answer to this question. Sure, Putin is currently in a tough bind. He must take everything he can from China, even if that means Russia is seen as the country's pet. After all, he sees the conflict in Ukraine as central to his fight to keep his regime and confront the US, so being China's pet is currently the lesser of two evils. But Putin has already demonstrated how much he's willing to sacrifice and let his people endure for the sake of neutralizing perceived threats to Russia's sovereignty, so it's highly unlikely Russia will submit to China forever. So despite many reports that Russia has sealed its fate as China's vassal, let's not jump to any conclusions, not when the dependence in this relationship isn't so one-sided, and not when dependence doesn't necessarily equal subservience for Russia. Remember, Russia is still the #1 nuclear power in the world, and it still boasts a rather resilient economy and some strategic advantages that allow it to maintain a degree of autonomy in its dealings with China. Let's break it down. It's undeniable that the war in Ukraine has crippled Russia's economy for a while, but 2 years after the invasion started, it seems that it bounced right back. In 2023, the Russian economy registered a robust growth rate of 3.6%, which came on the heels of a recession in 2022. But even 2022 wasn't as disastrous as predicted. Russia's economy was predicted to shrink by 12%, but only did so by 2.1%. This outcome even confounded the International Monetary Fund, which subsequently revised its forecast for 2024, predicting that the Russian economy might record a 2.6% growth. But how is this possible when several rounds of Western sanctions have been levied against the country? Russia has military spending to thank for this. Producing military equipment has kept the country's factories pretty busy, benefiting all industrial sectors. The revenue from oil and gas exports also helped. Now, you might ask, doesn't China have a hand in both of these areas? The answer is yes, but that's not the only contributing factor. The volume of Russian oil exports to India and a few other developing countries can be comparable to exports to China. Plus, just because China has a major share in Russia's trade doesn't make the country entirely economically dependent. Just take Australia as an example. China has a 26% share in Australia's foreign trade, more than Russia. Yet you don't see Australia making any long-term concessions to China. It's quite the contrary, really. Australia is actually a part of anti-China alliances like AUKUS, a security pact consisting of Australia, the UK and the US, whose aim is to contain China's influence in the Indo-Pacific region. But let's go back to Russia's resilience. The situation is pretty much the same in the import department as it is in the export department. Countries like Turkey, India, and the United Arab Emirates have had no problems selling sanctioned goods to Russia, ensuring the necessary inflow of goods to the Russian market. Also, we did discuss the many concessions Russia made to China. However, there are many more Russia has refused to make. This includes joining China's flagship project, the Belt and Road Initiative, which aims to facilitate trade and investment flows across Asia. Russia also didn't recognize China's territorial claims in the South China Sea. It also refused to allow the relocation of polluting industries into its territory, or unilateral tariff restrictions, or even eliminate visa requirements for Chinese nationals. These moves, or lack thereof, suggest that Russia can still hold its own to some degree when it comes to China. But why isn't China pressing harder, considering Russia's precarious position? It's simple, really. China needs Russia too. After all, China can act as a global peacemaker all it wants, but the fact remains that virtually no other country sees it that way. Instead, most global powers, with the US at the helm, see China as a dangerous threat. And with a hostile US, a disillusioned Europe, and a wary Asia, China doesn't exactly have a surplus of friends on the global stage. So it needs Russia as a counterbalance if it's to achieve its goal of becoming a global and Asian rule setter. Plus, China can use Russia as a case of study of sorts. Let's explain. Beijing has long viewed Western sanctions against China as inevitable. Thanks to the war in Ukraine, the country now has a front-row seat to how these sanctions actually affect the economy of a major power. China gets to see which protective measures are effective and which are not, which methods of response work and which backfire. Then there's also the issue of battle-testing weaponry. You see, China hasn't been involved in an outright war for over 40 years. This means the nation had no chance to test its military equipment and strategies in a real-life scenario, especially against Western adversaries. Russia is doing just that in Ukraine. Since a huge chunk of these weapons has some ties to Russia, the war in Ukraine gives China the chance to see these weapons' durability, performance, and effectiveness in modern conflict against their Western counterparts. This also gives China a chance to gauge which Russian weapons to acquire next. But it's also worth mentioning that Russia's invasion of Ukraine also serves as a cautionary tale to China. As you probably know, China has similar ambitions in regards to Taiwan. However, if the country's military leadership ever thought an invasion of Taiwan would be a swift victory, the situation in Ukraine should probably give them cause to pause. After all, instead of demonstrating that one of the most powerful military forces in the world can easily subdue a smaller neighbor, the invasion of Ukraine showed that military might can crumble in the face of determined resistance. This unexpected outcome can also mean that China has gotten itself tangled with a losing team, and one that doesn't really like to lose at that. So it's going to be interesting to see what the future holds for both Russia and China. For now, we'll ask you, do you see the relationship between Russia and China as a mutually beneficial alliance? Or do you think Russia is currently nothing more than China's junior partner? If so, will the situation change? And when? Has Putin truly maneuvered his country to a dead end, or is there an out? Russia's endless, messy war is dragging China down with it, and Beijing is losing patience. For Xi Jinping, Russia is looking less like a useful ally and more like a stumbling, ungrateful liability. Worse yet, China is starting to eye some of Russia's own territory, sharpening the knives for its back while Russia is distracted in Ukraine. Xi's message to Putin is clear: get out of Ukraine or else. And this isn't just about Ukraine. Russia has been pushing China's buttons for centuries. From stealing land in the 19th century to constant power plays, the relationship has always been shaky. To understand how deep this tension runs, let's take a closer look at their long, bumpy history. After World War II, China underwent major cultural and industrial changes, positioning itself as the Soviet Union's unofficial second-in-command in the communist world. At the time, the Soviet Union, one of the world's largest economies, provided China with essential resources, weapons, and military equipment, but their alliance was never smooth. When Stalin died, Mao Zedong expected China to take over leadership in the communist bloc. Instead, China remained second fiddle to the Soviet Union until its collapse in 1991. That power struggle still lingering today. Ironically, the US played a pivotal role in normalizing relations between China and the Soviet Union. With tensions still rising between the two, China saw the US, the enemy of its enemy, as a potential ally. This set the stage for an uneasy triangle where the Soviet Union, China, and the US each influenced the other's policies. Fast forward to the post-Soviet era. Russia, now the Russian Federation, sought to mend its relationship with China as both countries began to view the US as a growing geopolitical threat. This is the backdrop to today's so-called limitless alliance, an alliance built more on shared enemies than genuine friendship. For the last decade, this bond has deepened, thanks to the steady leadership of Putin and Xi, both working together to counterbalance US influence. But the cracks have always been there. China hasn't forgotten Russia's past betrayals, and Russia still views China with caution. And those cracks? They first became obvious during the Cold War, when a rivalry between supposed allies almost pushed them to the brink. But the bad blood between China and Russia stretches back much further than the Cold War. To see just how deep this rivalry runs, we have to go all the way back to the 19th century, when Russia was snatching land from China's grasp. While other imperial powers returned Chinese territory after the Opium Wars, Russia held on tight to what it grabbed, and China has never forgotten it. As part of the so-called unequal treaties, Russia claimed Outer Manchuria, a chunk of land that effectively blocks China from the Sea of Japan and gives Russia a strategic foothold in the region. This sparsely populated land might not seem like much, but its loss still stings. And it's not just about the land, it's about the rivers. The border between China and Russia, drawn along the Amur and Ussuri rivers, remains a constant source of friction. China believes these rivers should be shared, while Russia insists on controlling them outright, including the lucrative shipping routes they offer. Tensions boiled over in 1969 when the Soviet Union and China fought a bloody battle over Damansky Island, or Zhenbao as the Chinese call it. Hundreds died, but Russia claimed victory, a victory that still leaves a bitter taste in China's mouth. One particularly contentious spot is Bolshoi Orozyski Island, Haixiazi. Strategically located at the confluence of the two rivers, this 130 square mile island could be a key port for maritime transport. If China ever takes full control, it would put Russian territory and the major city of Khabarovsk right within striking distance. Russia knows how dangerous this is, which is why it's been desperate to hold on to it. And while the 2004 treaty gave China half the island, it's clear that's not enough for Beijing. In 2023, China released maps showing the whole island as Chinese territory, signaling that Xi Jinping hasn't let go of these territorial ambitions. Russia might have its hands full with Ukraine right now, but China is quietly sharpening its claws, waiting for the right moment to reclaim what it sees as rightfully theirs. And it's not just about a few disputed islands. Siberia and the Russian Far East, brimming with resources, are the real prize. But Russia's problems are even closer to home. Take Bolshoi Orozyski Island, for example. While still largely undeveloped, its location makes it a highly strategic prize for both China and Russia. For Russia, the problem is painfully obvious. The island lies right across from Khabarovsk, the second largest city in the region, with a population of over 600,000. If China were to fully control the island, Khabarovsk would suddenly be a stone's throw from Chinese territory. Easy pickings if things get ugly. This isn't just a hypothetical nightmare for Russia. We've seen this play before. Just like with St. Petersburg during World War II, when Russia forcibly seized Finnish land to push its borders further from the city, Moscow will do whatever it takes to protect its so-called national interests. Outer Manchuria and these contested islands, they're no exception. Russia knows the stakes, but the game is slipping out of its hands. On paper, the dispute over Bolshoi Orozyski was resolved by the 2004 treaty, which gave China half the island and access to key shipping routes along the Amur and Ussuri rivers. But as we know, China isn't one to settle for half. Sure, they got more than they bargained for without firing a shot, but Xi Jinping isn't done. Far from it. Xi is clinging to old grudges, and Russia's current weakness might be the perfect time to act. What Russia thought was a closed chapter could be blown wide open, and the island dispute is just one small part of a bigger picture. China's territorial ambitions don't stop with Bolshoi Orozyski. The 2004 treaty might have given China half the island and some shipping rights, but it's clear that wasn't enough. In 2023, China published maps labeling the entire island as its own, signaling that Xi Jinping still has unfinished business. But that's not all. China also renamed key cities in Outer Manchuria, further stoking tensions. For Russia, this is more than political posturing, it's a warning. The same territory disputes that sparked conflict in the late 1960s could come back to haunt them, and China's eyes are now set on something far larger: Siberia and the Russian Far East. These resource-rich regions are becoming increasingly attractive to a China desperate for natural resources, and with a population 10 times larger than Russia's, China is better positioned than ever to make a move. One major prize? Lake Baikal, the world's largest freshwater lake by volume. With China's groundwater supply becoming increasingly undrinkable, the demand for fresh water is skyrocketing. Throughout the 2010s, Chinese companies tried to secure land around the lake to build pipelines that would pump water into China's densely populated regions. Though local protests forced Russia to shut these projects down, China's thirst for resources isn't going away. With 90% of its groundwater undrinkable, China now needs new sources, and Russia's remote, untapped territories are the perfect target. The stakes are high for both countries. Russia's struggling economy and shrinking population have left vast parts of its territory vulnerable, while China's growing need for natural resources is driving its ambitions. And Beijing, getting Russia out of Ukraine is just the first step in a larger game. With the war being waged for over 2.5 years now, it's become clear that Russia's main attributes are aggressiveness and flagrant disregard for human life, both military and civilian, Russian and Ukrainian. This presents a huge issue for China, particularly due to its forward-thinking attempts to create a second axis of power and influence that would rival the US. And to create that axis, China will need more resources, which plays into one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects in the world, the Belt and Road Initiative. The BRI is a near-global project for China to expand its sphere of influence via roadways, cargo routes, and train tracks. Dubbed the New Silk Road, the goal of the project is to directly connect China with countries across the Himalayas, including the lucrative Middle East. Why? Oil and gas. Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Iraq are all among the top 5 countries in the world in terms of oil deposits and production. However, the only current oil trade between the Middle East and China is conducted via ships, which need to pass through the Indian Ocean and the Strait of Malacca. The strait in particular is one of China's sore spots, pretty much since every ship going from China to the west passes through it. And the strait is managed by Singapore, which is in turn allied with the US, with the latter having several military bases located near the strait. This presents a significant security and economic issue to China. If China wants to act on its long-term goal of trying to invade or occupy Taiwan, it needs to go directly against the US in that hypothetical scenario. The US, alongside other members of the Quad security dialogue, Australia, Japan, and India, would likely create an impenetrable barrier surrounding the Strait of Malacca, preventing Chinese trade ships from entering the Indian Ocean. With China dependent on naval trade routes, trying to import resources in this manner would be tantamount to political and economic suicide for a country so lacking in natural resources. And that's where the BRI comes in. By creating additional routes through which China can obtain its resources, it reduces the reliance it has on the Strait of Malacca for conducting trade and obtaining capital. Furthermore, the BRI initiative reaches far beyond the Middle East, as many as 145 countries have expressed interest in being a part of the project, many of which are developing nations in Africa and South America. Thus, the BRI can also help China carve more influence in the world and make itself a lucrative option for trade and geopolitical relationships. That being said, the BRI is nowhere near close to being complete. The project is estimated to cost as much as $10 trillion overall, and the first phases are only starting to appear in official planning documentation. Thus, China's primary goal as of now seems to be creating a stable overland connection to Pakistan. While not the BRI, this plan would be a significant victory for China, as it would allow trade to pass from China to Pakistan and then over into the Middle East, either via land or through the Arabian Sea. Either way, China can avoid both nations that have significant claims and influence in the Indian Ocean, those being the US and India itself. But what does Russia have to do with the BRI? Russia itself is just one of the targets for the initiative, helping China secure more resources from Siberia. But more importantly, with Russia and China being allies, Russia's actions directly reflect on China. With Russia playing the role of an eternal aggressor and China closely monitoring or even helping Russia by providing it with weapons and helping it skirt around Western sanctions, nations that might be interested in becoming a major trading partner with China might turn to the US instead. And that's why China is so adamant about Russia getting out of the war in Ukraine one way or another. The longer the war goes on, the more disruption Russia will cause to its alliance with China simply by degrading the latter's influence with the rest of the world. Additionally, the proposed BRI is already an expensive proposition, but the COVID pandemic severely hit the economies of the same developing nations that would be ideal candidates for China's investments. With their economies slowing down, many of the investments that China had planned have not panned out at all. Some nations have been put into debt, so subsequent investments would cripple their economy and make them more dependent on China as a result. While this might be a good thing for China overall, it sets a particularly bad precedent for how China conducts its business and helps create a different axis of influence. Another wrench in the global economy has been the Russian invasion of Ukraine, one of the world's largest exporters of grain. Russia, meanwhile, is one of the largest exporters of oil and petroleum products. The invasion has impacted both in this regard, temporarily halting Ukraine's ability to export through the Black Sea, while Western sanctions on Russia have made it unable to trade with other countries. That's left Russia needing to conduct its trade through China. While the bilateral trade agreement between the two countries reached a record high amount of $240 billion in goods in 2023, the trade throughout has started to slow in 2024, likely as a result of sanctions catching up to China. Furthermore, the US has started to threaten Chinese banks that still conduct business with Russia, forcing China to choose between backing the Russian economy or maintaining its influence across the world. So what's China's solution to this dilemma? It seems that Xi is trying to maintain an illusion of neutrality in the ongoing Russo-Ukrainian conflict. However, this illusion quickly disappears when you realize how much China has been helping Russia, and on multiple fronts. When Russia was hit with sanctions by most of the Western world, it was only left with BRICS, the intergovernmental alliance consisting of Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, and the United Arab Emirates. Their continued inclusion is likely due to the fact it's still a possible major oil and gas exporter. It's highly probable that BRICS is being led by China on all accounts, and Russia only gets to play along since it's still a relatively big economy on par with some of the other members. Most of the BRICS members have been helping Russia skirt around the sanctions by importing goods from other countries, relabeling them, and then sending them to Russia. Out of all the BRICS countries, China by far has the most influence and impact on the Russian economy. With Russia practically banned from using the US dollar, the countries have turned to the yuan and ruble to conduct bilateral trade. This hasn't slowed Russia's economy as much as the Western world would have hoped when the sanctions first hit. Additionally, while China has been peddling the idea that it doesn't directly support Russia's advances in Ukraine, the reality is quite different. Since Russia doesn't actually produce most of the high-tech parts that go into modern weapons and vehicles, it turns out China was the country's biggest supplier all along. China has also been using its immense industrial capacity to manufacture parts for the Russian war machine. The BBC estimates that 70% of all machine parts and 90% of all electronics and microchips that end up in Russia come either directly from or through China. All of these factors make it clear that while China and Russia have a strong alliance, it's actually more tenuous and uneven than it looks. For all the support China has been providing to Russia over the 30 months of war, Russia hasn't managed to make any significant progress in pushing further into Ukraine. Throughout the entire 2024, in fact, Russia has occupied roughly 600 square miles of territory. On the other hand, Ukraine has managed to achieve pretty much the same level of control of the Russian region of Kursk within a few weeks. With Russia unwilling to back down from its current war efforts, it turned to China for support, and China's plan for Russia to get out of the war is pretty bold. China's proposal for the so-called peace agreement is to simply proclaim the current situation as the status quo. China would like to see Russian sanctions dropped, which would allow it to trade more openly with China, thus further entrenching its influence in Russia, all fighting to stop, and the current territory that Russia occupied remains under tentative Russian control. The statements that China has issued are also controversial because China still maintains that it's a neutral country in the conflict, despite overwhelming evidence that it supports Russia. Their peace agreement plan would essentially help Russia win the war. But regardless of what China's statements actually are, the intent is clear. It wants Russia to get out of Ukraine, even if that means redrawing the Ukrainian borders. Otherwise, China may see its alliance with Russia degrade heavily in the coming months. If the Western threats of sanctioning Chinese banks become reality, it could mean a big hit for the Chinese income from trade with Russia. Additionally, the increasing NATO support for Ukraine means that Ukraine has been receiving more and more modern weaponry. NATO's chief officers believe that it might be time to give the green light to Ukraine to let them use the long-range missiles donated to them to strike deeper into Russia. This could potentially turn the tide of the war itself. If Moscow gets directly attacked, Putin might lose all of his leverage within the country and public support. Why does this matter? Well, as we established previously, both China and Russia haven't had a change in leadership in over a decade. If the war in Ukraine starts going sideways for Russia, there might be a scenario where Putin is forced to leave his post as the president, or worse, gets forcibly deposed in a revolution. Should that happen, there's no telling whether the next head of the Russian state maintains such close ties with China. If there's enough pressure from the West, the new government might turn 180 degrees towards the US, completely changing the geopolitical situation, not only for China, but perhaps for the world as a whole. And China doesn't want that to happen under any circumstance. That's why Xi is adamant about wanting the war to end as soon as possible. Seeing as Russia doesn't have any plans of relenting in its advance in Ukraine, its only option is to make bold proposals that might hopefully sway the world leaders into accepting the outrageous terms. But if that doesn't happen, and it probably won't, what's going to happen to the Russia-China alliance? Truthfully, probably not much, at least for a few years. As of now, China is still relatively happy with how its economy is growing and how much influence it can garner from other countries. So long as their BRI plans don't stray too far off course, countries would likely turn to China out of necessity, putting them right where China wants them. As for Russia, it might not be the biggest benefactor of China's economy for long. If the banks stop working with Russia, its economy might spiral out of control. This would turn its partial dependence on China into a full one, effectively allowing Xi Jinping to control the Kremlin's war and geopolitical rhetoric. If China closes the valve of money and weapon parts coming into Russia, the latter might be forced to submit. But that would put China in a bind, as it would need to publicly announce that it's stopping the already illegal skirting of sanctions. This could cause it to lose popularity with the BRI nations. Effectively, the problem between China and Russia is circular in nature. Both countries need one another, but Russia won't listen to China's demands, and China doesn't have enough influence to force other countries to do the same. On paper, this caustic combination should have caused the alliance to dissipate, but China is also using Russia as a scapegoat and leverage to garner support from other countries that are not as friendly to the US. In China's mind, perhaps truthfully, if they were to leave Russia to be the sole enemy of NATO, there might be no telling how BRICS countries would split their allegiances. While the alliance is informal in nature, its members have shown that they can support Russia in its ongoing war effort, which they may continue to do without China leading the pack. With many of the members taking a wait-and-see approach to the war in Ukraine and how it affects global geopolitics and economy, China is practically forced to do the same. Despite all of that, China still has one final trick up its sleeve through its border dispute with Russia. If Putin doesn't relent in his ongoing war effort, China might just decide to act on this. It would practically force Russia to choose between invading Ukraine and keeping its Far East secure. This would be one way to get Russia out of the current war, albeit by forcing them into the next one. Only this time, China wouldn't be helping Russia at all. Considering how inept the Russian military has proven to be at invading Ukraine, China could very likely succeed at occupying Outer Manchuria without significant difficulty and reinforce its previous claims on the region. But it's also possible that China will go a step further and move deeper into Siberia to get the true bounty of the land: access to Russian natural resources. Without Russia being the go-between for trade, China's industry will be poised to reach new heights, with free access to more minerals, timber, oil, and water. Of course, in this scenario, there are two factors that make life difficult for China. First, the US is already mounting pressure on China with regard to Taiwan and reinforcing its stranglehold on the Strait of Malacca. If China makes an offensive move, the US might follow. This could plunge the world into a new world war, with alliances quickly coming undone between countries that support the US and NATO, with Russia and China each playing their part. Secondly, Russia is virtually tied with the US for the world's largest arsenal of nuclear weapons, with about 1,700 nukes each ready to go at the push of a few buttons. China also has a nuclear weapons supply of 500 warheads, but only about 24 of them are ready to go, and even those are in uncertain condition. With Russia's nuclear deterrence policy being that it justifies the use of nuclear weapons should another country with access to nukes attack them, Putin might just press the mutually assured destruction button. But with a concentrated attack on China, Russia wouldn't even need to use most of its nuclear bombs, just enough to replicate the attack on Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in World War II. It would set the Chinese economy and industry basically back to where it was at its beginnings as a communist country. So China must plan things carefully. Its only feasible option is to repeatedly warn Russia to get out of the war with Ukraine before it's too late. But it also can't sever ties with the country, as the BRI isn't nearly ready yet. Thus, the alliance between Russia and China will stay strong on paper, but both sides will start making contingency plans that will need to be adapted depending on how the war effort is going. But what do you think? Will China force the issue on Russia to get out of the war? Pretending to match the capabilities of the American military, a thoroughly corrupt regime, and an intelligence operation so poorly planned, Russian bombers were communicating on unencrypted civilian radios. We've done the impossible and narrowed down Putin's many embarrassing failures in Ukraine to the top 5. A key ability in social settings is the ability to read rooms, to gauge how people are feeling, and what is or isn't appropriate to do or say. Likewise, a fundamental piece of any military campaign is the ability to read the room as it pertains to entire nation-states. At every level possible, Russia messed up this key step in planning its invasion. The fault lies at the feet of both Putin himself and the Russian Federal Security Bureau. The FSB had completely failed to gather good intelligence prior to the invasion, and severely misjudged the military and political climate in Ukraine. For his part, Putin's tight information constraints leading up to the invasion and insistence of managing most aspects of it also led to a direct failure of his goals in Ukraine. Starting with the FSB, its intelligence failures directly led to Putin's decision to launch the war. Unlike the United States, Russia's intelligence apparatus is largely dominated by the FSB itself, which limits the ability to deliver contradictory information to whatever narrative or conclusion FSB analysts may have arrived at. The United States, by comparison, has a far more pluralistic intelligence apparatus, with multiple agencies all working to inform the President of the United States and his advisors. This commonly leads to infighting between agencies, but it also provides a much clearer and nuanced strategic picture than what was available to President Vladimir Putin in February of 2022. The fact that the FSB is as corrupt as the rest of the Russian establishment doesn't help matters either. Prior to the invasion, the Kremlin was still coasting off the success of the 2014 Crimean invasion, which was by all accounts a highly successful intelligence coup that saw the strategically important peninsula fall very quickly to Russian-backed separatists, themselves backed by Russian military forces wearing uniforms with no insignia. A failure at any step of the way would have led to a catastrophic and deadly confrontation with the Ukrainian military while it occupied extremely defensible terrain. Crimea has very few avenues of approach usable by large numbers of armored vehicles, and an amphibious invasion would have been extremely costly. In Crimea, Russian intelligence had correctly guessed that a significant portion of the population would support a Russian coup, and that local actors would take up arms if encouraged against the Kyiv regime. These same actors would also provide for the logistical base needed to support Russian military operations during the early expeditionary phase, when Russia was still pretending it was not engaging in an invasion of Ukraine, and thus was limited in how overt its support it could be for its infamous little green men. The story of the Russian-Ukrainian war is yet to be told in its entirety, and likely won't be for years to come when secrets come to light. However, it's clear that Russian intelligence had assumed that the political environment in Crimea was prevalent across most of Ukraine. Most Ukrainians, they believed, would support a Russian invasion and regime change, and the massive nationwide protests sparked by Ukraine's Russian-backed president snubbing a deal to draw closer to the EU was the result of minority players. Russian troops would be greeted with flowers. Instead, they were greeted with Molotov cocktails. What could have led to such a massive misread of the room, so to speak? Maybe the fact that the FSB largely didn't even bother to do its job prior to the invasion. Details remain scarce, but what is known is that months before the invasion, Putin approved several $1 million worth of funding for the FSB to conduct an intelligence reconnaissance of Ukraine and its military. The goal was to take the temperature across the country, gauge civilian receptivity to a Russian occupation, and how the military might respond. Government and military officials at various levels were to be bribed to either give up operational secrets or ensure that when the day came, they would refuse to send their troops into battle. Shortly after the invasion, it became clear that the Ukrainian government and military had, in fact, been penetrated to a small extent. The approaches to Mariupol and other eastern Ukrainian cities had in part been cleared of mines deployed to stop Russian advances. Some Ukrainian units did not receive orders to move out, their orders delayed or confused by traitors from within. There were even some acts of direct sabotage. Overwhelmingly, though, Ukraine was fully prepared to meet the invasion head-on. How could this be after an investment of millions of dollars into a massive intelligence operation meant to ensure an invasion would have popular backing and there would be little resistance? Probably because the FSB stole most of the money. As of yet, the reports are unconfirmed, but the evidence is damning. Soon after the invasion quagmired, rumors circled that the bad intelligence was a result of little intelligence work having actually been committed. Allegations that the FSB's Fifth Service, which is dedicated to the security situation in former Soviet territories, had simply stolen most of the money, may have been substantiated by the following purge conducted within the FSB by Putin, with an unknown number of them arrested or fired from their positions. The GRU would also become the lead on further intelligence within Ukraine. The then head of the Fifth Service, Sergei Beseda, was rumored to have been arrested, but later it was revealed that he'd simply been placed under house arrest. Rumors circulated that he'd been sent to Lefortovo prison, where Stalin once committed political purges. But US intelligence pushed back against these rumors, and in 2023 he was seen at a public event, with Kirilo Budanov stating, quote, "Beseda continues to perform his official duties." It can be hard to blame Beseda and his Fifth Service cronies for stealing most of the money allocated to their operations prior to the invasion, because nobody in their right mind could have predicted an invasion was coming. In fact, most senior military officials didn't even know an invasion was being planned all the way up to the week before the actual invasion. Individual soldiers didn't know they were being sent to war until as little as a few hours before they were ordered to move out, with many being told to simply follow the vehicle ahead of you. Many of these initial troops expressed great surprise at suddenly discovering they were crossing the border into Ukraine. Not preparing for invasion is another of Putin's top mistakes in his execution of the war, but for once he might not actually be to blame for making this massive blunder. To understand why Putin may not actually bear the blame, it's important to understand a concept at the very heart of Russian military and government culture, known as vranio. It's the practice of collective lying. A subordinate lies to his commander. The commander knows that he's lying. The subordinate knows that the commander knows that he's lying, and yet both pretend it's true. On and up the entire chain of command, almost certainly to Putin himself. It can be hard to pin down when this unique facet of Russian culture came about, but it has its roots in the authoritarian and corrupt system of the Soviet Union. Soviet bureaucracy suffocated all aspects of Russian life, and by concentrating power, it allowed for a flourishing of corruption. Quotas had to be met, and if they were met on paper, that was just as good as if they were actually being met. This made accurate planning all but impossible, seen in the results of the Soviet Union's terrible performance in Afghanistan and Russia's terrible performance in Georgia and both Chechen wars, but it kept everyone up and down the chain happy and, more importantly, wealthy and in power. The way it works is like this. A Russian junior commander accepts the budget necessary to take troops to the firing range. Instead, he pockets most of that money, and the unit ships out for some ceremonial shooting. The junior commander then reports to his senior commander that his unit is fit for combat. All men are expert marksmen. The senior commander, who pocketed a portion of the training budget, already reports this up the chain to other more senior officers who have already taken their own bites out of the training budgets of multiple units, on to the very top, where President Vladimir Putin receives an official report from his defense minister that all Russian infantry are expert marksmen and score 50 out of 50 bullseyes. Putin, then acting on very bad intelligence from his own military, orders an invasion of Ukraine with his crack and elite military force. Given the incredible readiness and performance of his military and training exercises, he finds there's little need to make a full preparation. In fact, he probably thinks his military is already fully prepared because he's been told fuel, ammo, food, and medicine stockpiles are all full up. What he doesn't know is, thanks to a culture of corruption, the troops that will be spearheading an assault into Ukraine have been stripping the copper wire from their combat vehicles and selling off fuel so they can buy vodka from local Belarusians. This last part is not a joke. There were mass reports of exactly this happening up to the eve of the invasion. After all, theft is a common feature of the Russian military and is widely accepted by underpaid senior and junior staff. Putin had sought to keep his invasion of Ukraine a surprise, mostly to deny the West any leverage and the time to mount an appropriate response. Politically, this was an apt move, even if it was a strategic disaster. Prior to invading Iraq during Desert Storm, the Iraqis loving it so much they asked for a sequel in 2003, the United States conducted an exhaustive air and missile campaign against Iraqi infrastructure. A blistering barrage of air and missile strikes systematically destroyed Iraq's air defense network, or simply left it blind and unable to communicate. Senior commanders were unable to relay orders or receive them due to destruction of lines of communication, and key government apparatus and means of command and control were dismantled. This left Iraqi forces off kilter and unable to mount an effective defense against US and allied forces. Putin's army did none of this, and while it was a strategic blunder on a truly historic scale, it also made sense in a way. Denying the West time to react would hopefully splinter them in support of Ukraine and prevent an influx of military equipment to the Ukrainian armed forces. It also put the West off balance politically, with Putin able to control the narrative. And he took this gamble because he was under the impression that Ukraine would collapse within days. This was the information that he had received after all. Thus, there were no preparatory strikes, no intelligence and sabotage campaign, just a mad dash to Kyiv. It also explains why his own military had no idea an invasion was coming until it happened, and there are very strong indications that even Putin's most senior people had no idea either. Prior to the invasion, CIA Director William Burns traveled to Moscow to deliver a warning to his counterpart, Nikolai Patrushev. Per Burns, Patrushev appeared genuinely surprised at the allegations that Russia was going to invade Ukraine, and then shaken at the detailed intelligence the CIA had of such a plan that he himself lacked. Similar reports from a meeting with Sergei Lavrov indicate that he too was completely unaware of a serious plan to invade Ukraine. Thus, Putin, acting on very bad intelligence, had already sabotaged his own military's attempt to take Kyiv quickly and bring an end to the war. He'd seen the United States' blistering invasion of Iraq and believed that his own forces were capable of such a feat because this is exactly what he'd been told for years. The lack of preparation was so extreme that as Russian forces were thrown into retreat or destroyed, Ukrainian soldiers made some astonishing astonishing discoveries amongst what was left. One of these discoveries was a soldier who carried with him instructions printed out from Wikipedia on the proper operation of his heavy weapon system. Units were discovered to be carrying maps of Ukraine from the 1960s, and radios were so scarce that many soldiers used their personal cell phones to communicate, leading to a massive intelligence coup for Ukraine and the precision tracking and targeting of Russian forces. If Ukraine had had HIMARS in large numbers at the start of the war, it's very likely that Russia may have suffered such catastrophic losses to precision strikes that the entire invasion may have been called off after only a few months of fighting. The preparation and coordination was so bad that Russian medics didn't have enough supplies to treat wounded, leading to the looting of pharmacies and any stores in seized territory that had medical supplies. As Russian forces moved into Ukraine, several Russian units marched directly through the red forest that surrounds Chernobyl, so named because of the red color that the trees adopted after exposure to radiation. These men dug trenches and fighting positions into irradiated soil, leading to a large number of them being sent to Belarusian hospitals with radiation poisoning. For Russia's armor, little thought had been given to the routes that it would take into Ukraine. The operation was timed to coincide with frozen ground, allowing vehicles to navigate with ease. However, military planners failed to account for the effect that dozens of heavy military vehicles would have on Ukrainian roads, leading to road deterioration so bad that vehicles were forced to attempt to drive on the shoulder next to the road, inevitably getting stuck in very thick mud. In the span of a few weeks, while the West was arguing about escalation and what equipment to provide to Ukraine, the Russian military had become the largest donor of military aid in terms of abandoned tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and air defenses to Ukraine, a title it continues to hold to this day. The lack of preparation and intelligence failures extend to Russia's air forces as well. On paper, Russia absolutely dwarfs Ukraine's own air force and had the needed air power to conduct such a large campaign on its own border. In reality, Russian intelligence and ISR capabilities were so bad that the initial wave of airstrikes meant to shut down Ukrainian air defenses all missed their targets. The Ukrainians, acting on US intelligence, had already moved their air defense equipment. As much as 3 days will be required to get authorization to relaunch an airstrike against the latest position that those defenses had taken up, inevitably meaning that in most cases, those units simply weren't there anymore. Russia also flew combat missions with an almost criminal disregard for the Ukrainian Air Force, likely operating under the assumption again that the UAF would not present significant resistance. In the opening days of the war, Russian strike aircraft flew alone and unescorted, leaving them prey for Ukrainian fighters who flew low under radar. To counter this, instead of flying combat air patrols and escorts, Russia opted also to fly low under radar, which left them vulnerable to Ukrainian man-portable air defenses like Stinger missiles. Fostering this culture of corruption and ineptitude is another of Putin's greatest mistakes. But for Putin, the thing that may end up costing him the war is a feature, not a bug of his government. Like any dictator, Putin can only remain in power as long as he continues to hold either loyalty or leverage with his subordinates. One way of ensuring loyalty and leverage is to fill most senior positions in government with individuals who are either too incompetent to pose a threat, fiercely loyal, or who hate each other more than they hate you. This keeps the people most likely to overthrow you, those with their hands on the levers of government and military power, either too incompetent or divided to try it. This was best displayed in the infamous rivalry between the former defense minister Sergei Shoigu and Wagner PMC's former leader Yevgeny Prigozhin. Wagner was the most important PMC in Ukraine, second in overall importance only to the Russian military itself. Their rivalry was poison to Russia's performance in Ukraine, with both sides constantly undercutting or even outright sabotaging each other. In order to draw out Wagner's casualties and weaken it overall, the Russian military would routinely deny Wagner shells for its artillery. There are very credible allegations that Wagner would retaliate by feeding information to Ukrainian forces on the location of senior Russian officers, who would very promptly receive a visit from a volley of American HIMARS-launched GMLRS. There are verified instances of both sides simply shooting at each other or capturing each other's personnel as prisoners. While this rivalry was ruinous to the war effort, it prevented the two most powerful threats to Putin's power from joining together. When Prigozhin led his infamous march on Moscow, there are reports that some military officers did show support, but overall the military sided with Shoigu and Putin, undercutting a would-be rebellion. The moment that Prigozhin turned his forces around from Moscow was the moment that Putin's strategy of keeping his subordinates divided against one another paid off, even if it means the Russian military had to, and continues to, endure apocalyptic casualties. Perhaps Putin's most fatal mistake, however, was underestimating the West, though here too it may be difficult to blame him. When Russia invaded Crimea in 2014, the world barely responded. There were strong sentiments and speeches from Washington to Berlin, but barely more than that. When sanctions were implemented on Russia, they were a slap on the wrist. Military support for Ukraine was limited to largely defensive equipment or medical supplies. The West didn't have much stomach for a major confrontation with a nuclear power. But even more than that, it had little stomach for spoiling a very lucrative trade partnership with energy-rich Russia. Allegations that have been made since Vietnam appeared to be true. The West was spoiled and decadent, with no stomach for war. While the Obama presidency did take some steps to bolster Ukraine's ability to resist a larger invasion, mostly with investments into Ukraine's intelligence agencies, which would reap massive yields in 2022, the White House did little to create a strong deterrent against further Russian aggression. NATO training missions were launched to train Ukraine's military, but there was absolutely no chance of Ukraine receiving NATO-standard equipment to make itself a hard target against invasion. Those NATO training missions would also reap a significant yield in the war to come, but Ukraine still looked a very soft target from the Russian point of view. The Trump presidency only increased Ukraine's vulnerability from the Russian point of view. President Trump repeatedly stressed the global system of partnerships and alliances that the US depends on, especially with Europe. The antagonistic attitude from the Trump White House towards European capitals, combined with his very friendly relations with President Putin, all served to fuel assumptions that the West would be incapable of a unified response to a Russian invasion. The Biden administration would quickly work to repair these relationships, but Europe was still wary of the possibility of a single-term Biden and America turning back once more towards isolationism with a Trump win in 2024. Confidence in America's leadership had been badly shaken, once more serving to fuel Russian assessments that Biden would not be able to hold together a Western coalition against a Russian invasion. Biden's reluctance to provide direct military assistance to Ukraine also fueled the assumption that in case of war, the West would never risk escalation by providing heavy equipment to Ukraine. Europe, for its part, did not do much to deter a Russian invasion either, fully embracing Russian energy. Despite warnings from both the Obama and Trump administration, Europe had made itself so dependent that Putin believed he had the leverage needed to keep Europeans out of Ukraine. Former German Chancellor Angela Merkel's policy of containing Russia by engaging in bilateral trade further convinced Russian analysts that Europe would take little interest, besides some diplomatic protest, in what happened inside former Soviet states that were not a part of NATO. All of these assessments could not have been more wrong, and Russian analysts should have probably paid closer attention to shifts in the global landscape post-2020. While it was likely impossible to predict Europe, especially Germany, being willing to bear the massive economic pain of breaking energy ties with Russia, other political shifts were more evident. The September 2021 AUKUS Pact between the US, UK, and Australia was a fundamental shift in Pacific power structures, with the US and UK breaking a major taboo in the region by enacting a plan to equip Australia with nuclear-powered submarines. This would significantly alter the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific against an increasingly belligerent China, threatening all-important US-Chinese trade relations. Even if Putin eventually wins the war in Ukraine, an incredibly unlikely proposition, his Russia has already lost more than it could gain. Whether he himself survives the war or accidentally falls out of a window when Russian oligarchs can no longer stomach the economic pain Russia is under, one thing is clear: the world will remember Putin as one of the most disastrous leaders in Russian history. We've covered Putin's top 5 disastrous failures in Ukraine, but do you think it ends here? Where do you think his blunders will take Russia next? And how far could this spiral out of control? November 2024 will go down as the month that shattered Putin's war machine. His so-called special military operation has turned into a special kind of disaster. Russia isn't just losing troops and tanks, it's losing the ability to fight altogether. Massive casualties, record equipment losses, and a collapsing ruble are hitting Russia all at once, threatening to bring Putin's entire war effort to its knees. This isn't just a bad month, it's the kind of month that could change everything. So why was November 2024 such a turning point, and what exactly went so wrong for Putin? The answer starts with troop losses. A lot of troop losses. On December 1st, the New Voice of Ukraine reported that Russia's army suffered its highest irrevocable and sanitary losses of the war so far in November 2024. The numbers make for terrible reading for Putin. A staggering 45,720 of his personnel were killed or injured during the month, according to Ukraine's defense ministry. That number is roughly equivalent to 3 entire motorized rifle divisions of the Russian army. Equipment losses were equally horrendous for Russia. Ukraine managed to destroy 307 of the country's tanks during November, adding to a tally that had already exceeded 9,500 by the time the month began. Those numbers may not have come as a surprise to Putin. Ukraine's defense ministry says that Ukraine managed to take out 279 tanks back in October, with another 291 falling to Ukraine soldiers in September. That's a 3-month average of a little over 292 tanks, showing that Putin is losing equipment hand over fist. while he's also losing soldiers. Alternatively, we can look at this in tank battalion terms. A single Russian tank battalion contains 31 of these monstrous machines. That means that November saw the country lose nearly 10 of its battalions, with September and October not being far behind. Add it all together, and the last 3 months have seen Putin lose a little over 28 of Russia's tank battalions. The monetary cost of the November tank losses is around $450 million. Add November to September and October, and Russia's financial losses in tanks alone easily tops $1 billion. And the equipment problems don't stop there. In December 2024, the Kyiv Independent reported that Russia also sacrificed 899 of its armored combat vehicles and 884 pieces of its artillery to the altar of Putin's special military operation. Again, those numbers add to the already catastrophic equipment losses that Russia has experienced since February 2022. The armored fighting vehicle destruction Ukraine wrought on Russia took the tally up to over 19,500 vehicles lost. Artillery systems lost had already pushed past the 21,000 mark for Russia, with Ukraine's November exploits putting it on the verge of breaking 21,000 pieces of artillery destroyed. The new voice of Ukraine has the breakdown again. A single division of Russia's army has 18 self-propelled artillery installations. Assuming all 884 of the lost artillery pieces are self-propelled, that means Ukraine spent November 2024 decimating the capabilities of 49 of Russia's artillery divisions. As for the cost, that's another $700 million that Putin has poured down the drain as he tries to batter Ukraine's fortifications into submission. All told, the new voice of Ukraine says Russia blew through $3 billion in lost equipment and weapons during the month. The country simply can't sustain these types of losses. Okay, so it was a bad month for Russia, you might think, but a single month doesn't mean that the country is on its knees. Perhaps Russia wouldn't care were it not for the fact that the record-breaking November losses came on the back of another month in which Russia broke records. That's right, October was almost as bad for Putin and his cronies in the Kremlin. On November 10th, the BBC reported that the UK's Chief of Defence Staff, Sir Tony Radakin, had called on the country's government to provide more money for its military. His goal is to increase the UK's defence budget from 2.3% of national gross domestic product, or GDP, to 2.5%. What does any of this have to do with Russia? Radakin also touched on Russia's losses for the month while making that call. He told the UK government that Putin was losing soldiers at a rate of about 1,500 every single day. He also pointed out that the country was then on the verge of suffering 700,000 people killed or wounded. The enormous pain and suffering that the Russian nation is having to bear because of Putin's ambition. It wouldn't take long for Radakin's predictions to come true. Russia's troop casualty toll now stands at about 753,000, according to Ukraine's Ministry of Finance. On top of all this, Radakin added, Russia was experiencing those massive losses for tiny increments of land, and is now at a point where it's spending more than 40% of its national budget on the war. So not only is Putin losing his soldiers by the thousands every day, but he's putting an enormous strain on the state, according to Radakin. That gives us 2 record-breaking months of losses for Russia. October 2024 was bad enough. Losing around 1,500 soldiers a day is a casualty rate that Putin should never have allowed to happen. But then November 2024 came along and broke every record that Ukraine managed to set in the previous month. If we didn't know any better, we'd think that Putin was trying to break the back of his own country. Maybe he is. After all, it's not just the massive losses of personnel and the $3 billion in destroyed equipment that make November 2024 Russia's worst month ever. There are several other issues that threaten to cripple the country for good. Sticking with the troop loss issue for the moment, Russia didn't just experience its worst month for total losses in November, it also had to deal with its single worst day, several times. On November 29th, the Kyiv Independent reported that the previous day saw Russia finally break through the 2,000 soldiers lost in a day barrier. Its final tally for November 28th, 2,030 soldiers dead or injured in a single day. And that wasn't even the first time the country had recorded its biggest ever single-day losses in November. Russia had only just set a new record of 1,950 casualties in a day on November 12th, and it had broken the record even before that. On November 11th, Kyiv released figures claiming that Russia had lost 1,770 of its troops on November 10th, which broke the record of 1,740 lost in a single day on May 13th. So what does that mean for Putin? November 2024 saw him break his own record for sacrificing his soldiers 3 times in the space of 18 days. And these weren't tiny increases. The November 12th record shattered the one set on November 10th by over 200 soldiers. The new record set on November 28th is 80 soldiers higher than the one set on November 12th. Russia is being forced to sit back and watch as its death count spirals out of control. And November just went from bad to worse for Putin and his army. On November 18th, news emerged that President Joe Biden had given Ukraine the green light to start using America's long-range ATACMS missiles in Russia. The United Kingdom followed suit by allowing Ukraine to use its Storm Shadow missiles to strike on Russian territory. Both decisions blindsided Putin. He'd hoped that his constant threats of retaliation for crossing this particular red line would have been enough to keep those missiles out of his country. They weren't. And Ukraine wasted no time in taking full advantage of its allies' decision. Just the day after it received approval from the US, Ukraine used its ATACMS missiles to mark the 1,000-day anniversary of the war with a strike on a Russian weapons depot in Bryansk. The attack was designed to take out missiles and artillery that would likely have found their way to the soldiers Putin was using to storm Kursk, meaning it came as a big logistical blow to Russia. About a week later, the Kremlin was also forced to admit that Ukraine had carried out 2 more ATACMS strikes on Russian facilities. Russia's defense ministry claimed that it shot down 7 of 8 missiles fired, with one hitting its target in one strike on an airfield named Kursk-Vostochny. The other strike targeted Russian S-400 positions in Lotarevka, with 3 missiles supposedly shot down while 2 reached their targets. Storm Shadow hasn't been left out of the fight. November 20th brought with it news of a strike using the UK-supplied missiles on what's believed to be a command headquarters in the village of Marino. The Guardian reports that Russian war bloggers believe that Ukraine fired 12 Storm Shadows in the attack, with the strike also believed to have taken out some of the North Korean soldiers Putin has received to supplement his counteroffensive in Kursk. So not only does Russia have to deal with losing record numbers of soldiers in November, but it also has to worry about Ukraine now having access to weaponry that could cause even more losses in December. Could it get any worse for Putin? As it happens, yes, it could absolutely get worse for Russia. As all of this was happening, the ruble was also falling off an economic cliff. Toward the end of November, the ruble cratered against the US dollar. By November 27th, it had fallen to its lowest rate since the beginning of Putin's special military operation, hitting 110 rubles per dollar. That's a stark contrast to the exchange rate in the months before the war, when the ruble traded at between 75 and 80, and the ruble kept falling. By November 29th, it was at 114, marking a 36% decline from the rate of 84 rubles per dollar recorded in August 2024. A small recovery has taken the ruble back below the 110 mark at the time of creating this video, but the currency having such a terrible exchange rate couldn't have come at a worse time for Putin. Sky News reported that panic reigned in the Kremlin as Russia was forced to watch its currency devalue. Kommersant, which is a daily Russian newspaper, said that the news resembled a war report, while telling its readers they needed to stash as many rubles as possible for the economic turbulence that is to come. This massive currency drop came in the wake of a new wave of US sanctions that targeted several Russian banks that allow the country to process international transactions. Gazprom Bank was the hardest hit. The bank, which is Russia's 3rd largest and has ensured that Russia can keep selling its natural gas to Europe, has now lost all of its ability to process transactions with other countries. That's a symptom of Europe spending the last couple of years collectively moving away from Russian gas. And even worse for Russia is that these new sanctions come amidst the country dealing with 8.7% inflation and a base interest rate of 21%, which has caused massive cost of living problems for the Russian population. So November has been a terrible month for Russia. On the battlefield, it's recorded its highest number of troop losses in a single month since the war began. It also broke its own record for single-day losses 3 times during the course of the month. Add to that the collapse of the ruble thanks to new US sanctions and Ukraine's newly granted ability to use long-range missiles in Russian territory, and you get a month that's broken Russia's back. Let's hone back in on Russia's massive troop losses for November. Why did they happen? The answer likely lies in Russia making even bigger pushes against Ukraine throughout the month. We start with Kursk. In August 2024, Ukraine made the bold move of launching what ended up being a counter-invasion of Russia. Within 2 weeks of launching that invasion, Ukraine controlled 93 villages and around 450 square miles of Russian territory. The move was hailed as brilliant, albeit a big gamble, at the time because taking parts of Kursk would give Ukraine more leverage in any future peace negotiations with Russia. Putin wasn't happy. The Kursk invasion humiliated him and shattered his carefully crafted image as a political strongman who could protect his people. He needed to take the territory back, and he spent much of November 2024 trying to do just that. On November 12th, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that Ukrainian forces in Kursk were now holding the line against a counteroffensive containing 50,000 soldiers. Our men are holding back 50,000 of the occupier's army personnel who, due to the Kursk operation, cannot be deployed to the other Russian offensive directions on our territory, Zelensky announced. The 50,000 troops Putin has deployed in Kursk likely feature the majority of the 11,000 to 12,000 North Korean soldiers Russia has received as part of its cooperative defense pact with North Korea. It's believed that Russia is likely sending military technology and financial support to North Korea in exchange for these troops. Putin has made the ultimate sacrifice of Russian secrets, along with the cash the country can ill afford to spend, to bolster his counteroffensive, and it's working, partly. Russia's November push into Kursk have resulted in it taking back around 40% of the territory it lost by November 24th. But it's this very counteroffensive that also accounts for many of the country's massive losses during its record-breaking month. On November 1st, Pravda reported that Russia had lost 15 battalions, amounting to 8,000 soldiers, since Ukraine took territory in Kursk. By November 6th, amidst the launch of Putin's counteroffensive, that number had exceeded 20,000 troops, along with 1,101 units of weaponry and military equipment, according to Ukraine's Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, Alexander Syrsky. More losses followed, with Russia also seeing 17 pieces of military equipment destroyed due to mine explosions during an attempted assault in mid-November. Add Ukraine's ATACMS and Storm Shadow strikes in and around Kursk, along with its defense of the territory it's captured against Putin's counteroffensive, and you have a recipe for massive troop losses on the Russian side. And then there's another big ingredient we can add to that recipe. In addition to the Kursk counteroffensive, Russia has been pushing to take more territory in eastern Ukraine. It's been succeeding, in a sense. On November 30th, the New York Times reported that Russian soldiers had managed to take at least 10 villages in the latter third of the month, and were starting to close in on the last two strongholds Ukraine has in Donetsk. If those strongholds, Velkaya Novosilka and Kurakova, fall, that would allow Russia to take out the smaller pockets of Ukrainian troops that remain, to ultimately take control over Donetsk. But that push has come at a massive cost. According to Operation Strategic Group Kortitsia, which is a unit of the ground forces Ukraine is stationed to the east, Russia's gains in November cost it a staggering amount of troops in eastern Ukraine. The group's spokesman Nazar Voloshin said, "November was a colossal month in terms of losses, and in particular, Russia suffered more than 35,000 casualties in our operational areas over the course of the month." Voloshin also said that the sheer number of Russian attacks in eastern Ukraine had intensified throughout November. "I should note that last week, the enemy conducted 1,156 attacks in our area of responsibility," he says, when referring to the final week of November. This is slightly more than the previous week, when there were 921 enemy attacks. This statement gives us some insight into how Putin is approaching his attempts to take Donetsk. Rather than relying on massive waves of soldiers, he's altered his tactics so that he now has small groups carrying out hundreds of assaults per day. The problem, at least according to Voloshin, is that Russia is deploying many of these small groups without armored vehicles or other key heavy equipment. That makes the groups easy picking for Ukraine soldiers, accounting for the massive casualty rate. It may be a different way of doing it, but it's still Putin's meat grinder approach in action. And therein lies the real reason why Russia has recorded record losses for November. It's now fighting the Ukraine war on two fronts, but Putin and his cronies still can't change their strategic approach. They're just throwing more and more soldiers at Ukrainian fortifications in the hope that they will eventually overwhelm the positions. The approach is working, slowly, but it's working at the cost of between 1,500 and 2,000 soldiers per day. So we come to the final question we'll ask in this video. What do these record-breaking numbers of troop losses mean for Putin? For one, Russia is starting to get desperate for a peace deal soon because it's running out of soldiers. That's according to The Conversation, which reveals that Russia is struggling to recruit the soldiers it needs to replenish its massive losses in Kursk and eastern Ukraine. That assertion is backed up by the fact that Putin has happily welcomed over 10,000 North Korean soldiers into his country to fight in Kursk. That's not something he would need to do if he was able to recruit enough soldiers to handle the problem himself, because taking those soldiers means he's now indebted to North Korean President Kim Jong-un. Russia doesn't want to be in this position. Its closest ally in the war is the only nation that is more of a global pariah than Russia. There's also the more tangible recruitment problems Russia faces. The BBC reports that NATO and Western military officials believe that Putin is managing to recruit around 20,000 new soldiers to Russia's military every month. Think about what that means in the context of November's record-breaking losses. Russia is only recruiting less than half the soldiers it needs to account for the losses as massive as the 45,720 experienced in November. Even more worrying for Russia is that these 20,000 per month are predominantly brand new soldiers. Some may be mercenaries and others with experience in combat, but most are wet behind the ears and likely to be sent to the front lines within weeks of recruitment, where they'll offer little more than being cannon fodder for Ukraine's guns. Putin is trying to get around this problem. At the beginning of November, Russia changed how it delivered draft notices. Rather than sending them via mail, the military now delivers them online. As soon as the notice arrives in an inbox, whoever receives it is immediately barred from leaving Russia, else they'll face stiff penalties, including jail sentences. No man in Russia is safe from this approach, assuming that the state has their records. Paying tax, renewing a driver's license, and anything else that requires interaction with state services is enough for the unfortunate individual to put themselves in line for Putin's draft. The tactics aren't going to work. Putin has already broken Russia's back when it comes to manpower. He's using these types of sneaky tactics to get more recruits because he's terrified of the public backlash he'll face if he creates a new round of mobilization. The simple fact is that Russia is running out of people to send to the front lines at a time when it's losing more soldiers than ever before. November 2024 may have been the month when Russia made substantial gains in eastern Ukraine and managed to retake 40% of its lost territory in Kursk. However, it's also the month where it broke records for the number of its soldiers lost or killed on the battlefield. When combined with the collapse of the ruble and Ukraine's newfound ability to launch long-range missiles at Russia, we may well be looking at the beginning of the end of Putin's ability to sustain his intense assaults on Ukrainian positions. But what do you think about Russia's November 2024 losses? Will Putin be able to replenish his ailing military with more people and equipment? Or is Russia's leader just waiting for President-elect Donald Trump to introduce his peace plan so he can exit his special military operation while claiming some semblance of a victory? The earth rumbles as a T-14 Armata tank rolls across the former Ukrainian border. A squad of Russian soldiers sits on its roof, guns resting half-forgotten across their laps. They chat idly, gently bumping along the road, swerving to avoid burnt-out vehicles and landmine craters. Out here, they're miles from the front line. For the first time in months, they're able to properly relax. No Ukrainian troops anywhere close. Even if they were, what could they possibly do? The Russians are sitting on top of a $7 million killing machine, 55 tons of reinforced steel with guns that could rip through just about anything. And underneath them growls an engine big enough to power 3 Ferraris. It's so loud they can hardly hear each other talking. And that's why it's such a surprise when just a couple of seconds later the entire squad is dead and the $7 million tank grinds to a halt and slides into a ditch. 16 kilometers away, nestled safely in an underground shelter, a Ukrainian soldier takes his VR goggles off and fills up a fresh cup of coffee. He scans the skyline out of his tiny window, concern etched across his face. Those Russian soldiers never saw the drone that killed them. It had been hovering several dozen feet above their heads for the last half mile. Not much bigger than a raven, it had been getting ready to drop a precision explosive on their heads. Almost a dozen men, along with millions of dollars worth of machinery, were destroyed in an instant by a drone you could buy off the shelf for almost nothing. It's safe to say that war will never be the same again. At first glance, you'd be forgiven for thinking that warfare in Ukraine had regressed. Russian and Ukrainian soldiers are dug in. They cling tightly to positions that they have fought hard to take control of. It'll take even more to take those positions back. Fortifications and defenses are paramount. In many ways, it feels reminiscent of the trenches in World War I. But the reality couldn't be any more different. The war in Ukraine has fundamentally changed warfare forever. New technologies, instant real-time information, unimaginably precise ranged weapons, AI and consumer-level tech have all transformed each strategic front in the war. If conflict has changed this much in the last few years, it's hard to imagine how it will look over the next 100 years. So let's take a deep dive into the technologies reinventing the battlefield in Ukraine, starting with the advancement that has captured the most headlines over the last 2 years: drones. Prior to the war, Ukraine had a blossoming drone scene. Filmmakers and racers alike were getting into the DIY world of FPV or first-person view drones. Once an enthusiast hobby, you would often homemake a drone using cheap parts bought online or 3D printed yourself. 4 motors each powering a little motor with a camera feeding live video into a small VR headset. Put one of these on and it really did feel like you were flying. Little did any of these enthusiasts realize that their garden project was about to become central to the survival of Ukraine. For centuries, armies have always struggled with seeing over the next hill. You can see the battlefield in front of you, but how do you know what's behind the next hill? Is there a supply depot, a whole battalion of reinforcements, or an empty field? In World War I, just a few years after the invention of the plane, the first one was used in warfare. It was November 1st, 1911. Italy and the Ottoman Empire were locked in a stalemate, and so one budding Italian pilot took to the skies in his canvas-winged monoplane. He couldn't fly very far or fast. The top speed of the machine was only 45 miles per hour, but for the first time, an army was able to conduct aerial reconnaissance. The Italians knew where key strategic locations were, roughly. They were going off one man's memory and a sense of direction, but it was intel never seen before. Then they had the bright idea of sending him back up into the air, but this time armed with 4 hand grenades to drop on the heads of those soldiers. These first missions changed warfare forever. Since then, we've had over a century of arms racing with billions of dollars poured into one-upping the other side's technology. It's brought us into an era of orbiting satellites, stealth bombers, million-dollar unmanned drones, and fighter jets that can level buildings before they can even be seen by the naked eye. And yet, it's not the expensive technology that's changed the battlefield in Ukraine, it's the cheapest. The attack drones pioneered by the US Air Force cost millions of dollars, need runways and air bases, as well as teams of mechanics and commanding officers, all for them to come slightly too close to enemy guns they hadn't spotted and get shot out of the sky. These tiny FPV drones that used to be just an enthusiast's hobby are now the most lethal aerial threat in Ukraine. They're so cheap that the military can buy hundreds of them in bulk for less than the cost of one soldier's yearly salary. They can take off and land anywhere, fly low, and are so small that the anti-air weapons designed to down fighter jets don't have a hope of hitting them. Not only can the Ukrainians now see over the next hill, as it were, they can see over every hill across the whole country with inch-accurate GPS data. They can pinpoint the precise location of strategic targets anywhere and everywhere and can have an effective range of up to 20 kilometers, meaning the pilots don't need to get anywhere close to the fighting. Load them up with 10 pounds of explosives and they can take out a tank, a radio mast, a room full of troops without ever putting a single life at risk, all for just a few $100s. The results are mixed. Some estimate that 50% of these unmanned drone strikes are a success. Footage of drones carrying explosives that blow up mid-flight or that fail to detonate entirely have been shared online. In one video, a Ukrainian drone crashed into a Russian vehicle's windshield but failed to detonate. Only the most experienced pilots can take down a tank, and even then it can take up to 10 strike attempts to succeed. Because these drones are so small and light, the heavier the explosives they are carrying, the shorter their range becomes, limiting them to less than 10 kilometers a lot of the time. But for just $400, this technology is in its infancy. Over the course of the war alone, it's gotten much more effective with each passing month. In a decade's time, who knows how much the consumer drone technology will have advanced? That 50% success rate will creep up higher and higher with each passing year. And the fruit of the investment into drones is undeniable. In 2022, the Russian flagship in the Black Sea sunk after being hit by 2 small missiles in the middle of the night. The ship had been the crown jewel of the Russian Navy with 510 crew on board. In 2024, the Sergei Kortov, a Russian patrol ship, suffered a similar fate at the hands of drones. And this has done more than just allow Ukraine to conduct targeted strikes. It's eliminated much of the fog of war from the battlefield. Secrets are much harder to keep now. Everybody can know where everybody else is at any given moment. A convoy of supply trucks can't sneak their way south even if they are miles away from enemy troops. A group of soldiers setting up an ambush in the woods can be spotted at any moment by a drone half a mile away. If you're not in cover, then you're not safe. Which leads us perfectly to our next topic: artillery. Let's wind back to the 20th century to a fictional battlefield. You've just had a recon plane fly overhead and inform you that there is a massive supply depot 20 miles from your position on the other side of the front line. You know fairly precisely where it is, and you've got access to the best dumb artillery currently available, again costing millions of dollars. So you do the calculations, adjusting for what you assume the wind speed is, and fire. The recon plane tells you that you missed. The wind must have changed the trajectory. You fire again, and again, and again, until you finally hit the target. This is how it's been for decades. Even when you know where the enemy position is, hitting it from such a long distance is essentially a game of luck. Until now. The mantra in Ukraine is now one shot, one kill. Thanks to the drones, along with the other advances in radar and targeting, you can line up your shot with much more accuracy, but it goes further than that. The dumb artillery that was used before was called that because once it was in the air, it was in the air. You couldn't adjust its course or correct for any changes. With modern missiles, you can. Ukrainian forces have been using the American-made Excalibur shells, which use GPS data alongside their own Kvitnik shells, which use a laser guidance system. These shells with the correct targeting data can take out a Russian tank, building, or group of troops from long distances with just one shot. No more need for endless inaccurate shelling. One shot, one kill. This efficiency brings the costs right down and makes combat encounters much quicker, minimizing casualties. The US has shipped a number of M7 Bradley Fire Support Team vehicles to Ukraine to help with this very approach. These aren't your standard tanks. Instead, they are packed full of advanced targeting systems capable of rapidly identifying multiple targets at the same time. Even while under fire, on the move, and defending themselves with their 25mm gun, the B-fists can mark multiple targets for long-range artillery to take out. One shot, one kill. Imagine where this technology will go. Picture a small drone hovering over the battlefield, marking targets with precision. Weapons that essentially behave like hackers in a Call of Duty lobby, aiming themselves instantaneously at enemies and firing before they have a chance to get to cover. Cluster missiles, which split off at the last moment into a dozen individual homing shells capable of taking out a group of guards in a room full of hostages. A swarm of attack drones, all powered by AI systems that operate as one cohesive unit, with or without a pilot, and attack their targets like a swarm of bees. What was once science fiction is now virtually on our doorstep, and it will only get cheaper and more accessible over time. On the topic of science fiction, we couldn't talk about the advancements in battlefield technology without talking about the biggest one of them all, which has only just started to make its presence known: AI. Unlike a new kind of explosive or vehicle, AI is not confined to one part of the war. It is and will continue to pervade every aspect of it. As the joke goes, military generals don't have a clue what AI is, but they want to buy it by the barrel. Let's look at some examples. AI has been massively helpful behind the scenes in one of the most important but least talked about aspects of warfare: logistics. Supply chains are vital to winning a war. If a tank runs out of fuel, it's dead in the water. If soldiers don't get fed, they'll die. If you have one day to get hundreds of reinforcements from one side of the country to another, you need your logistics to be as efficient as humanly possible. Any inefficiency will cost lives. And if there's one thing that AI is good at doing, it's making things efficient. Machine learning is capable of taking mammoth tasks like feeding an entire army that are simply too big for one person to keep in their head and process the entire workflow at lightning speed, seeing the whole big picture all at the same time in a way that the human brain just can't. Ukrainian forces have been deploying AI to make their supply chain run as efficiently as possible, saving time and freeing up manpower for other important tasks. But it's so much more important than just that. On the ground, forces have been using AI technology to scan the faces of corpses and identify the dead bodies. In the past, this simply wouldn't have been possible, but now on the ground, soldiers with nothing more than a smartphone are able to know exactly who has been killed there and then, an invaluable piece of intelligence. Away from the battlefield, we have seen AI being used by Russia as part of their propaganda campaign. When terrorists attacked a show in the Moscow concert hall in 2024, despite the Islamic State claiming responsibility, Russian news outlets took the opportunity to spin the attack against Ukraine. Airing footage of a Ukrainian interview, they used AI technology to doctor the audio. The footage they used had nothing to do with the attack, but they made it seem as if the Ukrainian presenter said, "It's fun in Moscow today. I think it's a lot of fun. I'd like to believe that we will arrange such fun for them more often." As generative AI technology leaps ahead of itself every year, with new iterations further blurring the line between what's real and what's generated, this is undoubtedly going to be used as a major propaganda tool in the future. Now you cannot even trust recorded video footage or a person saying or doing something which was once fairly reliable. The definition of truth can now be bent to whatever agenda those in power have. Digital warfare in general is only going to become more and more prominent. Over the course of the war in Ukraine, there has been an ongoing invisible war raging behind the scenes. Russian and Ukrainian hackers have been at each other's throats for the last couple of years, fiercely defending their own systems from attacks while looking to crack open chinks in their opponent's armor. This war has marked arguably the first Internet of Things attack in a major war. Ukrainian hackers were able to get into Moscow's electric car charging grid temporarily. Charging stations across Russia's capital were suddenly displaying messages of support for Ukraine and damning criticisms of Vladimir Putin. Users could no longer plug in and charge their electric vehicles. Whilst this hasn't exactly turned the tide of the war, it has been an omen of what's to come in future wars. A group of renegade hackers in Ukraine were able to temporarily bring down a key piece of Russian infrastructure. What could a more organized, better prepared, and equipped hacking force do in the future? We rely on technology in virtually every aspect of our everyday lives. What if all of Russia's card machines went offline? What if their traffic lights went haywire? What if their state-run news outlets were taken over? What if Russia's government IT system was cracked? In the past, we've seen countries' healthcare databases held for ransom, crippling hundreds of hospitals. As quantum computers capable of cracking even the highest levels of encryption creep closer and closer and AI becomes more powerful, we're going to be seeing this invisible side of the war become more prominent year on year. But there's another side to this digital warfare too, and one that has massively transformed Ukraine's strategy: OSINT, open source intelligence. Ukraine have been able to comb through and harvest the open source intelligence from civilians across Ukraine, as well as hapless Russian soldiers. All of the cell phones and social media accounts in the country have now turned into a vast and thorough spy network. Gigabytes and gigabytes of OSINT have flooded the world, with analysts combing through all of the details to identify enemy positions, equipment, strategies, and more. As soon as the war started, millions of people across the world started carefully studying footage and posts shared online against real-world GPS data and other open sources of information. Every photo, video, message, or email coming from the region could shed light on the bigger picture of what was actually happening. This has turned the tables on the international stage in a way that Putin was not expecting at all. He has always relied on false narratives to twist reality to fit his own agenda, but with the bountiful amounts of OSINT available from this war, his claims are easy to disprove. Before Russia even invaded, as they were gathering forces near the Ukrainian border, Putin claimed to the international community that he was simply responding to an emergency. In decades prior, it would have been his word against Zelensky's, as journalists would rush to try and corroborate which facts they could. With OSINT, it was evident right away that he was lying. His troops were there preparing to invade. This immediately undermined his credibility to the observing countries before the war had even started. Every claim since then has been fiercely scrutinized and fact-checked using the wealth of OSINT available, which has just exposed lie after lie. Contrast this with Ukraine's figurehead Volodymyr Zelensky. Before the war, Zelensky wasn't very well known globally. Some knew him as the president that used to be a comedian, but that was about as far as his reputation extended. But during the war, Zelensky has used social media and the internet expertly to comprehensively win the like war. He has painted a picture of himself on the internet that's inspiring and human, fiercely independent and moral. In doing so, he has humanized the Ukrainian people to the wider world and garnered a lot of international support for his cause. In previous generations, he likely wouldn't have been able to have much of a platform for his voice to be heard, but with such easy access to the internet and a talented communications team, he became the Time magazine Person of the Year. This may not seem like such a big deal in the face of soldiers dying in a war until you think of the economic impact that it's had on Russia. Never before have we seen so many brands very publicly pull out of a warring nation. Since the start of the war, over 1,000 major companies have voluntarily reduced their services in Russia or pulled out entirely. Apple, Google, McDonald's, Nike, Amazon, Disney, pretty much any company that you could name off the top of your head has voluntarily decided to screw Russia over. This would not have happened without the internet. These businesses are here to make profits. We all know that, but a key part of making a profit is having good PR. When it became a good PR move to leave the Russian market and a bad move to stay in, they all jumped straight to Twitter to announce their decisions. That whole side to the war is something we've never really seen before, but it's likely to continue being a key battleground in future conflicts. But at its core, war never changes. T.R. Fehrenbach, a famous historian, once said that you may fly over a land forever. You may bomb it, atomize it, and wipe it clean of life. But if you desire to defend it, protect it, and keep it for civilization, you must do this on the ground, the way the Roman legions did, by putting your soldiers in the mud. Warfare is undoubtedly going to look very different from this point onwards. Pandora's box has been opened in terms of AI, drone attacks, and digital warfare. But at the end of the day, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is being fought as wars always have, to take land. At the start of this video, we compared Ukraine today to the trenches of the First World War, and that's a perfect way of seeing how, despite the strategies changing, the core approach remains the same. Ukrainians are holding onto their land with soldiers stationed in position. Russia is looking to take those positions and put their own soldiers there instead. No matter how complicated conflicts get with advanced precision shells, OSINT data flooding the internet, and drones dropping crude explosives on soldiers' heads, this will always be the way it's fought and won. That is, of course, until AI robot soldiers replace people and we start fighting our wars with killer androids, but thankfully we're not there quite yet. As we can see, the war in Ukraine has fundamentally changed the landscape of modern warfare. From consumer drones to advanced AI, the battlefield will never be the same again. But what does this mean for the future of global conflicts? How do you think advancements in drone technology will shape future wars? Could AI-driven warfare reduce human casualties, or will it lead to more devastating conflicts?